Chapter 9:11. Chapter 9:11. Furious, the temperature around Lionel dropped by several measures. A shocking feat considering tongues of fire were still nipping around the battlefield in him. But this was simply the representation of how much rage he was feeling. Lionel had never truly gotten a chance to vent out what had happened to him almost 3 years ago now, but that didn't mean that he had gotten over it. He usually wore a charismatic smile and had a carefree attitude, but that only hid a deep-rooted pride that he didn't often show. A pride that had been encroached upon in this way once before, and a pride he refused to allow to be encroached upon again in this very same way. The moment Lionel sensed the change, he reacted, shooting backward as his gaze became frightening. He didn't need to think very much to understand what was going on. With all the prayers that the head of Misty Woods had been so pious in chanting, it didn't take a genius to understand that he was a very religiously devout man. It also wasn't that much of a leap for Lionel to conclude that his strength and that odd, mysterious force also came from his worship. For someone like Lionel, he might not have believed in a god back when he was on third-dimensional Earth. But he was also a person who was very flexible when presented with new information. He wasn't stubborn to a fault. In fact, he could very easily accept new theories with solid proof behind them. Since he was aware that there was higher dimensional beings far greater than himself, and he could see how the head's prayer led to an increase in his strength, was it that great of a leap to accept that gods and goddesses, or at least what lower dimensional beings would perceive as gods and goddesses, did exist? And in the case that such a being existed, it also wouldn't be too large of a leap to believe that they got something out of people worshipping them. Not much different from how Lionel's kings might grew stronger the more subordinates he had. In fact, it was quite eerily similar in that way. Having reached a conclusion up to here, what would a god that lost a devout follower do? Shouldn't there be some sort of punishment, so that no one dared to casually target their people? By this point, everything made sense. Clearly, Lionel was being targeted for having killed a follower of this evergreen goddess. In fact, he was precisely being punished because the man in question, Osenjover, was deeply involved to the religion to the point where he had become a titled member. This so-called title differed depending on the religion, but the label of titled member was the same across all of them. Simply put, they were individuals who had enough belief to gain some small favor from their god or goddess. However, understanding this didn't lessen Lionel's fury in the slightest. In fact, it only made his rage all the more palpable. What was the underlying meaning of this action? Wasn't it that the followers of this religion could kill as they pleased, and those without a god or goddess to protect them could only accept whatever punishment such a person deemed them deserving of? What kind of bullshit was that? Lionel's pupils flickered with red. If this seal was on the same level as the one Shield Cross stars had put on him, it would have only been a matter of a thought to obliterate it. After all, the current Lionel was so far beyond that previous Sail in strength that it would be child's play. But clearly this one was on a completely different level. Lionel could tell that not only would it brand him, but it would even weaken him like a curse. Well, the sight of Lionel shooting back and dodging air was a shocking one for many to behold. Most here weren't even qualified to sense what was chasing Lionel. In fact, any member of the Evergreen religion or church would be shocked at Lionel's mere reaction to it, let alone the fact he was actually still dodging it. Fuck off. Lionel's roar shook the skies. He pointed his finger forward at what seemed like empty air, his gaze alight with a furious crimson. At that moment, a beautiful light of twisting golden red appeared. Those that saw it initially felt it was among the most gorgeous colors they had ever seen. Something about it seemed otherworldly and transcendental. But in the blink of an eye, that fascination turned to horror. A fear the likes of which rose up from the very depths of their hearts took hold. It was a kind of instinctual fear, like one a child would have to the dark or prey would have toward its predator. This energy felt like it was meant to take hold and destroy the world. Everything in its path turned to ash. Bang! The energy exploded, clashing with the air before blasting through in the next moment. It tore into the ground and incinerated a line down the army of the three organizations. Anyone touched by this force was left without a body. Anyone even near it burst from the inside out, every ounce of liquid in their body vaporizing in an instant. The world fell into silence. A moment later, All that was left was a certain young man heaving out deep breaths, his gasps radiating out with a black fog that seemed to originate from his inner organs. Lionel had suddenly gone from a man who finished a battle with 3 fifth-dimensional existences, without breaking a sweat, to a mortal man who looked like he had just finished running a marathon. If marathons also charred your inner organs black, that is. It was safe to say that Lionel was furious even now. He shouldn't have been pushed so far just to deal with something like this. Planet Valiant began to rumble. The line Lionel had cut through the earth bubbled forth with waves of lava that seemed to originate from its core. The destruction, such a small beam of energy, was beyond their wildest imagination. They could only look toward Lionel as though he was some sort of monster. It was at that moment that several cloaked figures descended from the skies, seemingly not worried about the planet's state in the slightest. All of their gazes locked onto Lionel. Chapter 9:12. Chapter 9:12. Forget LT. The destruction Lionel had just caused was enough to, ironically, put the fear of God in anyone. It was just an instinctual, ingrained fear that one would find it hard even to face this force, let alone fight against it. The truth was that as Lionel's body grew through the dimensions, so too did his Scarlet Star Force. To have a force known to cause the greatest destruction in his body made it a miracle that Lionel was even alive at this point. But that was the benefit he gained for having been born with such an innate force node. One might wonder, then, did this mean that Lionel would never be capable of using his Scarlet Star Force? If it increased in difficulty to use every time he broke through, then what was the point of being born with such a force node to begin with? The reality, though, didn't quite work like this. It could be said that rather than Scarlet Star Force shackling Lionel, it was actually the other way around. For a force to be ranked amongst the top 10 of a powerful force like Star Force, one could imagine that this wouldn't just be for lower dimensions, but especially so for higher dimensions. In fact, the ranking system was based on the highest dimension said force could reach. Scarlet Star Force was essentially a high-dimensional force, forced to restrain itself in Lionel's body to an artificially lower dimension. This meant that every time Lionel broke through, Scarlet Star Force was actually just undoing chains Lionel placed on it. What was the difference between this and Scarlet Star Force growing with Lionel? The difference was that eventually, the Scarlet Star Force would return to its original state and stop outgrowing Lionel. When that day came, Lionel would finally be able to use the gift he was born with without reserve. For now, though, even in the 5th dimension, Lionel felt like he was on the verge of dying after having used it for just a small moment. Still, the result shocked even Lionel himself. Lionel had been racking his brain, trying to figure a way out of this. But he knew that even his current dream force wasn't enough to counter that seal. In the end, he had no choice but to bring out one of his greatest trump cards. What he hadn't expected, though, was to almost cause the destruction of the planet. Lionel had felt it. Had he been able to hold out for about 10 more seconds, he could have caused the entire planet to implode. Of course, asking for 10 more seconds when he had barely just held it for a split moment just now was far too much to ask. But the reality was shocking nonetheless. And it happened to be a reality that these cloaked figures had all witnessed. Even as lava overflowed from the split in the earth, they only had eyes for Lionel himself. Innate force node, and a very powerful one at that. I have a feeling that you can't use that attack more than once, right? I wonder what kind of state your body is in right now. The man chuckled. Who asked you to blaspheme a 3-layer hand of the evergreen goddess? I would take a step back and let them hunt you down to the death, but they won't mind if I present your corpse to them with a small piece missing. Right? The lead cloaked figure stared at Lionel, as though he was looking at a priceless treasure. Lionel paused practically mid-cough. What did you just say? His tone was icy to an extreme. As ridiculous as it had been for the temperature to drop previously, it was even more ridiculous now. The heat of Scarlet Star Force still hung in the air. Even now, the foliage of the trees in the surroundings would spontaneously combust from time to time, erupting in a new rain of fire that would only make the situation worse. As though that wasn't enough, lava continuously pooled out from the split in the earth, forcing the youths in the surroundings to scatter and run, breaking the formation of the 3 organizations with absolute ease. And yet, the temperature still plummeted. Lionel's gaze locked onto the man before him, his fury from before still not having faded before this man dared to poke at the flames. When Lionel had learned that something of his had been taken out of his body when he was too young to do anything about it, he had already been furious. That anger wasn't satiated by his father helping him to regrow his innate force node. Rather, it was simply stored away. Lionel didn't care about the innate force node in all reality. After all, he hardly got to use it, and had been living life just fine without knowing it existed. However, the principle of it all infuriated him to an extreme. He had a feeling that if he hadn't had such a powerful father, wouldn't he be dead right now? Wasn't this yet another example of the people of the dimensional verse doing as they pleased to the weak? Prattling on about survival of the fittest, etc., etc. Lionel had no idea whether his parents had already made those who did this to him pay or not, nor did he care. Even if they had, this anger wouldn't fade because it was rooted in something deeper than just himself. And yet, this cloaked bastard, come from nowhere, had actually thought to poke at that open wound. It was difficult to see the face of the cloaked figure, but Lionel could almost feel his smile spread out into a wide grin. His chest puffed out, his gaze flared with derision, his contempt was so palpable that it hung in the air like a foul odor. I said, "Forget it. Just die," Lionel said coldly. An enormous sniper rifle appeared in Lionel's hands. Before anyone could react, a beam of blinding golden light cut through the air. The cloaked man didn't even get a chance to finish his words before his head was eviscerated into nothing, his headless corpse teetering back and forth before failing to maintain its balance and plopping to the ground. Chapter 9:13. Chapter 9:13. No longer the cloaked figures that had been standing around the leading man stood in shock. Though he had a big mouth, that man was still a Tier 4 expert. One had to understand that not all Tier 4 experts were of the same strength. Just like Lionel could battle them with ease despite not having firmly stepped into Tier 1, there were many Tier 4 experts stronger than what the head of Misty Woods had displayed. The truth was that the head of Misty Woods had a large weakness. He needed to be in a state of prayer to display such strength. However, the cloaked man Lionel had just killed could display the same strength without needing to rely on a god or goddess. And yet, just like that, he had been killed. To make matters worse, they were standing almost half a kilometer from Lionel. They had thought to probe him to see if he really could use that attack again or not. And yet, the result was absolutely devastating. In the blink of an eye, one of theirs had been killed. Lionel didn't even react to this. Standing within 500 meters of a sniper, even back on third-dimensional Earth, was a death sentence. To the current Lionel, they would have to stand more than 10 kilometers away to have a chance at dodging. Lionel had wanted to use this battlefield as a chance to gain some battlefield experience, and maybe hone himself a bit. The fact he wasn't taking this seriously was almost too obvious. He hadn't activated his bronze runes nor his spear domain. He was using a wooden spear and he had initially not even wanted to use the spear techniques he had learned previously. Unfortunately, his nonchalance almost caused him to suffer. Of course, there wasn't much he could do about being targeted by a god's seal, but it still pissed him off. Then these cloaked figures, obviously being the hidden experts the Milky Way Guild had sent, pissed him off even more. Clearly, this wasn't going to be the battlefield he got to practice on. In that case, he might as well just end this all as quickly as he could have before. With a slight shift of his barrel, Lionel's sniper rifle whirred to life again. It was unlike anything those around had ever seen. The moment it jumped to life, the barrel began to radiate with a beautiful golden light, following the pattern of force arts etched directly onto it. Before the light could make it to the end, though, several hovering discs of precious metals appeared before the barrel of the rifle, each with a slight curve of their own. Bang! The instant the rifle fired, the light charged out, coursing through these hovering discs of gold. If one looked closely, with every one it passed through, the beam of light only became more concentrated and faster. By the time it exited the last of the discs, it had a speed so fast that it was almost impossible to react to at all. In the blink of an eye, another head imploded. Run! The rest of the cloaked figures didn't dare to stay around any longer. Their hair stood on end and fear gripped their hearts. But what would running now do? With cold precision, Lionel sniped them down one after another. The last one, that Faye. I had already managed to make it more than 7 kilometers away despite how fast Lionel was shooting, and yet it didn't matter at all. He fell just the same. Lionel swept a gaze over the scattered remains of the 3 organizations' army. Are you all going to run? Or would you like me to kill you too? The army, which had already been scattered, didn't need to hear this twice. Without hesitation, they all dashed off, returning to the platform they had used to descend to the planet in the first place. They raged and jostled for position as they fought to be the first ones to leave. In the end, they ended up using far more time than they needed to eventually completely evacuate. Lionel's gaze on their backs was like the sigh of a reaper weighing down on them with a scythe. None of them even dared to look back as they rushed forward, unwilling to stay even a moment longer. Moments later, the battlefield was silent. Right then, there were several pairs of eyes on Lionel's back, which seemed all too ridiculous considering the sight of lava still gushing forth before them all. And yet, Lionel seemed far more fascinating than at all. Hephaestus clutched his daggers. Raylion didn't seem to have much of an expression at all, but something within his eye told a different story. As for Sail, she felt a whirl of complicated emotions. Just 2 years ago, she was powerful enough even to extend favors to Lionel. But now, the difference between them was so great that she almost felt embarrassed. Was this the benefit of being born from such a large family? Even if Lionel didn't benefit from their resources, was just having a portion of their genes enough to warrant such an enormous gap between the two of them? Unfortunately, that seemed to be the way of the world. Lionel coughed lightly, another clump of black fog flying from his mouth. Luckily, the passive healing of his snowy star owl lineage factor had increased. Unluckily, so had his Scarlet Star Force's ability to cause trouble. Lionel didn't even bother to cast Grand Heal. He knew that at his current level, it was absolutely meaningless. It wouldn't even heal a paper cut for him right now. He needed to research stronger spells. Luckily, his run-in with Goddess Evergreen had given him some ideas. Finally, Lionel looked up into the skies, his gaze narrowing. Without looking back, he spoke. I'm sure you all are smart enough to understand. From this day forth, Valiant Heart Mountain can no longer exist. For your own safety, I hope that none of you are stubborn about this. Chapter 9:14. Chapter 9:14. All her fault. Sail's heart sunk when she heard these words. At that moment, it all clicked. She understood exactly why Lionel had apologized to her before the battle even began. From the very beginning, he had already planned to say these exact words. This was his goal from the very beginning. You, Sail's voice trembled. She had tried so very hard, giving everything she had for the sake of keeping the organization she had been born in together. She owed Valiant Heart and her master everything she had. She had scratched and clawed, working herself to the bone so that she would never have to watch it crumble in her lifetime. The result of her hard work resulted in her neglecting her training. She had been so caught up in the politics that she forgot to raise her own strength. The result was her losing to Hephaestus, and that reality slipping even further from her. After that, she had reapplied herself, nearly entirely forgetting politics just for the sake of gaining a larger fist. In fact, even now, she had finally stepped into the quasi-fifth dimension. It was just unfortunate that this breakthrough often took decades, sometimes even more for those born in this region of the dimensional verse to complete. But once again, all of that was meaningless. Now she was being told the home she had done her all to protect was finished. And it would mostly be by the hands of the young man she brought here. Emotions of guilt, fury, unwillingness, all of it bubbled up within her. She didn't know whether she should cry, shriek, or rain down all the curses she could think of onto Lionel. She wanted him to both vanish from her sight, and somehow repay Valiant Heart for all the harm he had caused at the same time. The result of all of this was her body trembling beside herself. She clenched her fists so tightly that even the blood that began to pool on her palm couldn't find a path out. It only seemed to make her skin more crimson, her emotions slowly spiraling out of control. All the while, Lionel didn't even look at her as though he couldn't be bothered to. Just as Sail was about to implode, she found a wrinkled hand suddenly find its place on her shoulder. When Sail looked over out of reflex, She was stunned to see that it was actually her master. It only took a moment for Lionel to recognize this old man as one of the 4 mysterious experts who had moved out with all of them that day. His aura seemed to be particularly weak, as though he had been injured some time before. However, it was still just as strong as anyone else within Tier 4 that Lionel had ever met. This made Lionel believe that he might have even actually been Tier 5 or maybe even Tier 6, maybe even stronger. Lionel's mind instantly flashed with a thought. Case 793. Teacher Ingson guilty of gross negligence. In a campaign against our sworn enemy, the Oryx tribe, his decisions led to the death of 14 geniuses of our valiant Heart Mountain. The only survivor has been bribed into silence and has suffered through untold humiliation. Sale liars. Those were the exact words Raylion had said back then. Clearly, Ingson was more than just a teacher. In addition, the price he had paid to allow Sale to be the only survivor wasn't small in the slightest. The old man was practically on his deathbed. Beyond this, Lionel had a feeling that those 14 geniuses weren't just any geniuses either. They might have even been beyond Raylion in talent, if they could go on a mission with Ingson. The question was then, why was Sale there? Of course, this was all just speculation. Lionel had no way of knowing these things. Thank you. Ingson spoke lightly. From this day forth, Valiant Heart Mountain will be no more. But that's enough, Sale. You're not a little girl anymore. If you want Valiant Heart to be revived one day, you just need to be strong enough that no one would dare to stop you. Sale opened her mouth to speak, but all that came out was a sob. She finally couldn't hold it in any longer and dove into her master's arms. It's my fault. It's all my fault. Ingson sighed, stroking Sale's hair. It's not your fault. This is the fault of us old men. We lost out edge and let our enemies eat away at us until there was nothing left. Ingson knew how Sale felt. She thought that everything she tried to do to help only ended in disaster. Ingson even had a feeling that if it wasn't for the fact she was so weighed down by the matters of the past, she would have long since entered the 5th dimension. Let alone Raylion and Hephaestus. Sale was probably the most talented disciple Valiant Heart Mountain had ever produced, including their founder who managed to gain the favor of a Morales family heir. Back then, Sale was too eager, wanting to skip steps and grow more powerful more quickly. She ended up sneaking her way onto a mission she had no business taking part in. The result was the death of 14 of her seniors, and her own master being heavily injured to the point of near death. Of course, Ingson had told her many times that it wasn't her fault. Even if she hadn't been there, the casualties would have been terrible. It was a mistake on his part, not hers, that had caused such a thing. But the little girl had already internalized her guilt. And now she felt like she had done it again. It wasn't hard to point toward Lionel as the reason they would collapse now. He was at the very least a catalyst, if not the cause. Without him, maybe they could have survived a few more centuries and found a chance to turn it all around. But with his appearance, they were finished. It was her fault again. It was her fault Valiant Heart lost 14 geniuses that would have been their chance to turn things around. It was her fault Valiant Heart's most powerful expert was so severely injured that they were no longer feared anymore. It was her fault that Lionel had been able to come here and quicken their destruction. It was all her fault. All her fault. Chapter 9:15. Chapter 9:15. Unexpected voice. Lionel sighed inwardly. It wasn't in his heart to do things like this, but he had no choice in the matter. The moment he had decided to take the side of the Oryx, the fate of Valiant Heart had already been sealed. He couldn't help but shake his head to himself. Was he very much different from those people he hated so much? Why was it that he chose the Oryx over Valiant Heart? Wasn't it because he felt that their talent was greater? In their state of hyper-evolution, they even had a chance at becoming monsters that could rival talents from dimensions far higher than this one. Due to this, Lionel had felt that if he was going to invest in a group, the Oryx would be the very best. He could tell himself now that he was just doing this out of necessity, that after he accomplished his goals he would treat everyone equally. But would things really work out that way? History told tales of absolute power corrupting absolutely. Lionel wouldn't deem himself to be the perfect human being, and no matter how logical he was, he would often find himself fighting against that side of his being. Often, Lionel felt that he only leaned into his own morality so much because he was scared that if he didn't follow archetype of good person to the final point, he would be giving himself up to that darkness within him. Lionel had always said that he didn't fear losing his life to save someone others would deem worthless. What he feared was the day he would convince himself that his life was worth more than others, if that day ever came. Even he was scared of the monster he would become. Despite thinking and being aware of all of this, though, there was one reason Lionel didn't label himself a hypocrite, at least not completely. Valiant Heart had never wanted to help itself. During the time Lionel had spent with this organization, they were always fighting against progress, always gripped by a fear that not only stopped them from moving forward, but even forced them to regress. Despite knowing that he was a member of the Morales family, rather than taking this opportunity to soar into the skies once more, they cowered from it, worried about the consequences choosing to place their hopes in Lionel might cause. These simply weren't people that Lionel could take under his wing, at least not with how they were presently constructed. Unless they could change their mentality, this would be as far as any of them went. Lionel knew that he had a very fine line to toe. He both acknowledged that talent was necessary to make it in this world, while simultaneously believing that it didn't make one person worth more than another. If he wanted to stick to such ideals, it would be difficult to keep his head straight. The good news was that he had been blessed with opportunity. He had Little Black Star's ability steal powers on his side, and he had the silver tablet to wipe the consciousnesses away from them. This combination of treasures was almost perfect to deal with this moral dilemma, but it also made Lionel realize just how much luck was involved in this thing he called life. He had done all he could do for Valiant Heart. What was left was up to them. Young heir. Ingson called out once again to Lionel, trying to comfort Sale at the same time. Please take the pillars with you. They were the treasures of the Morales family to begin with, and were in no position to continue protecting them. Lionel, who was still facing away from the group and monitoring the air above, frowned. Those pillars? They had the ability to keep zones from permanently closing, thus allowing them to be repeatedly used as training grounds. It was a valuable set of equipment to have, especially if you managed to use them on a variant zone designed to bestow treasures to begin with. As good as this sounded, though, to the current Lionel, they were useless. Lionel's dreamscape suddenly flashed. Well, not completely useless, actually. With the new path of mage arts he was thinking up in his mind currently, the pillars would be a valuable asset, and might even allow him to create an extremely powerful earth-space elemental art. However, Lionel couldn't help but feel disappointed. The fact that Ingson was trying to give these pillars to me signified that he truly had given up. Maybe it's wrong of me to judge him for this. He's been injured for several decades now and probably feels he's at the end of his rope with no chance to progress forward, or even just heal himself back to his original height. Blaming him for this decision is cruel. Lionel took a deep breath, not responding immediately. After a while he nodded. I will hold them for you. If anyone of Valiant Heart decides that they are ready in the future, they can come to find me. A light of gratitude lit in Ingson's eyes. But he couldn't help but sigh when he looked down at the young girl in his arms. She had just been starting to cast the previous shadow on her heart away, finally allowing her to continue progressing. Would she ever manage to get rid of this one? Everyone, you've heard it well. This is no longer our home. You have half an hour to pack your belongings. The organization will send you all to a safe place as a final thank you for your service. Go. With heavy hearts, the students of Valiant Heart followed their orders. Those who had stayed behind so long despite the danger their lives were in were already the most loyal members of Valiant Heart to begin with. It was clear that none of them were willing. I guess they're not going to attack anymore? Lionel concluded. Just as Lionel was about to make a move to stop the flow of lava and dig up the pillars to his back, he heard an unexpected voice. Too cowardly to face what you've done, huh? Chapter 9:16. Chapter 9:16. Incisive Lionel didn't need to look back to recognize the voice of Hephaestus, of all people. Of course, Lionel knew why Hephaestus was saying these words. Lionel hadn't looked back from start to finish, so it wasn't too hard to guess that he was feeling guilty. However, It was still a bit of a surprise that Hephaestus would be the one to come to speak with him. From what Lionel could tell, everyone else had already rushed up the mountain. There wasn't even another line of defense here. It was clear that Ingson had trusted Lionel with protecting them while they went off to evacuate. But Hephaestus didn't seem to care much about this so-called evacuation. Cowardly? No. Guilty. I guess you can argue that. Lionel replied. The speed was too fast, and with a swoosh, Wang Xian was pulled into the whirlpool, like a little crucian carp that had been hooked and was violently pulled out of the water. Hephaestus snorted. Semantics. That's a pretty big word for a muscle brain like you. Hephaestus' lip twitched. Wasn't this bastard supposed to be feeling guilty? Where did he find the face to quibble like this? If you dare to fish against him like this, no matter if it's a strange thing on a mobile phone, or that ferocious giant fish, you'll have to pay the price. Plus, looking at Lionel now, even though it was hidden beneath his clothing, Hephaestus could tell that somehow this brat had come back with a physique even better than his own. So, who was the muscle brain exactly? Were you serious about keeping the pillars for us? Yes. Anyone who feels ready can come and get them from me. Even if I disagree that you are. It's not mine to begin with. I want police. Which of you can take it? To be honest, it's not very useful to me now. Or rather, it will be in the short term, but not in the long term. Ephizi is mocking him. So you're just going to wipe your hands clean of it all, HM? Don't you think you hold a bit of responsibility? Lionel shook his head and sighed, finally looking back toward Hephaestus. He was a bit surprised to find the abrasive young man to be red-eyed. He seemed caught between tears and rage despite how calm his voice had sounded previously. Hephaestus seemed as though he might eat Lionel alive. Who knows, maybe his ability would kick in and he would gain Lionel's ability as well. Who cared if he became a cannibal if he could accomplish what he and Raylion had always hoped to accomplish? Then it was noiseless and motionless. Instead of reviving here, it chose to disguise it. However, he didn't move. He knew that he was no match for Lionel 2 years ago, let alone now. He would just be setting himself up for death. Unlike Sale, he still hadn't given up. Raylion was too prideful to ask anything of Lionel. But he, as Raylion's right-hand man, would scratch and claw for anything he thought could help his brother rise to the very top. Lionel stared into Hephaestus' eyes for a long time. Despite the bestial aura radiating out from the latter, he seemed completely unmoved. If one's piece of sword energy can't solve the problem, then take a few more pieces. Wang Xian is going to kill it. Aren't you the one who's very cowardly now? Lionel spoke. Why are you beating around the bush? Just say what you want to say. What's there to be scared of? Hephaestus' jaw clenched. If a gaze could murder, Lionel would probably have died 10 times over. It's impossible for us to progress on our own. We'll always be labeled as the disciples of Valiant Heart. The other students might be fine, but those like Sale, myself and Raylion are too famous. We'll never be able to escape that label. No one would let us join their organization, and that would just be the bright side. The more likely scenario is that they'd offer us up to the 3 organizations, or the Milky Way Guild to curry favor. Stop beating around the bush. Lionel repeated. Hephaestus' eyes were practically spewing fire at this point. Take responsibility. We will fight for you and even help in your air wars. We just want resources to help us grow. If we're left like this, we'll never be able to reach a point where we can take those pillars back. Hephaestus had expected Lionel to pause for a moment and think about it. After all, even if they couldn't compare to Lionel, they were still great talents, right? Even ignoring Sale and Raylion, he himself was mostly limited by the caliber of beast he got the chance to eat. Hephaestus was slotted into the Swallower Ability Index, which was also separated into 5 stages. Speed, Efficient, Blackbody, Steel, and Dimensional Gut. Speed allowed one to digest at impossibly fast speeds. Such a person could consume far more energy than another, and thus recover far faster as well. Efficient allowed one to not only have the abilities of speed, but allowed them to eat with less wastage. Blackbody allowed one to consume 100% of the energy of their food, and even directly convert it into power. It could be considered the pinnacle of efficient. Finally, there was Steel. The next step from converting food directly into power was snatching the powers their food had had back when they were alive. As usual, the fifth-dimensional gut was reserved for savants. Such existences were practically void beasts in human form. The things they swallowed no longer had to be living, and some could even digest entire worlds with a single bite. By this, Hephaestus' talent was clear. He was actually at the fourth steel level. Even Raylion was only at the third stage of his telekinesis ability index. Of course, this was the case when Hephaestus was swallowing fourth-dimensional beasts. But who was to say he couldn't do the same with fifth-dimensional ones as well? After all, he had never had the chance to try. This was all to say that Hephaestus thought Lionel would at least think about it. But Lionel didn't hesitate in his reply. Not only did he not hesitate, it was sharp, incisive, and left no room for rebuttal. After hearing it, Hephaestus was stuck in limbo, forgetting even the fact that he should have been enraged. He almost couldn't believe what it was that he was hearing to begin with. He was that close from asking Lionel to repeat himself. Absolutely not. I will not accept murderers into my people. As far as I'm concerned, you deserve to die. Chapter 917. Chapter 917 Deal? Lionel didn't understand these people. Did they just expect him to forget? What happened to those 3 disciples that he had hung from a tree? What happened to those disciples that had died testing his apparently faulty products? Was he just supposed to ignore the fact that ever happened? In fact, maybe the fact he wasn't cutting Hephaestus and Raylion down where they stood was him failing those victims. Hephaestus blinked and shook his head before he truly registered what had just happened. The rage in Lionel's voice was hidden under a layer of coldness, and just listening to it made him feel as though a bell was ringing in his ears. What Hephaestus didn't know was that this was Lionel's king's might seeping outward. If Lionel had been more intentional with his actions, Hephaestus' head might have already imploded just from his words alone. The speed was too fast, and with a swoosh, Wang Xian was pulled into the whirlpool, like a little crucian carp that had been hooked and was violently pulled out of the water. At this point, the coercion in Lionel's voice was such that he could almost manifest his will into existence. Since Hephaestus was a dimension below him, he wouldn't even have the chance to fight back before his body listened to Lionel's will, almost as though these events were a story and Hephaestus was a character Lionel was writing. This was the difference between dimensions. A talent like Lionel might be able to rely on his lineage to fight above. But when a talent like Lionel was above a lesser talent like Hephaestus, the true difference between dimensions was as clear as day. The current Lionel might as well have been a god to Hephaestus. He could die to a single one of Lionel's thoughts. If you dare to fish against him like this, no matter if it's a strange thing on a mobile phone or that ferocious giant fish, you'll have to pay the price. It took a long while for Hephaestus to finally regain his bearings, but he felt as though his IQ had dropped by several points, like his brain had turned to mush. He completely forgot that he should have been enraged. When his vision cleared, he found Lionel still looking at him expressionlessly. But at that moment, he felt a deep-rooted fear in his heart that seemed birthed from something intangible to become a heavy representation of his reality. Hephaestus shook his head. They're not dead. We just sent them away. They didn't have much talent as disciples anyway, so we just staged some stuff, gave them some money, and shipped them off to enjoy the rest of their lives. Ephizi is mocking him. The moment Hephaestus finished saying these words, he suddenly snapped. Fuck you. Hephaestus regained his fiery edge, his canines extending and his pupils becoming slits. He suddenly realized that he had fallen under Lionel's coercion. His rebuttal should have been a gotcha moment. But instead, it came out weak as though he was pleading with Lionel to understand his plight. How could he not be seething? Then it was noisy and motionless. Instead of reviving here, it chose to disguise it. Ingson might have let them slander him, but he would have never allowed them to start killing disciples. For proof of this, one only needed to look at what happened to the seniors that tried to block Lionel, Aina and the other freshmen from entering the mines. Those seniors, for causing the potential deaths of their juniors, had been punished swiftly, harshly and without mercy. How could the seniors of Valiant Heart have reacted like that then? But suddenly let Raylion do as he pleased. If one's piece of sword energy can't solve the problem, then take a few more pieces. Wang Xian is going to kill it. Of course, Lion was talented, so one might think he would get a bit of extra leeway. But even in his injured state, Ingson was still the most powerful individual in Valiant Heart Mountain. He could have done as he pleased, especially to a disciple that was blaspheming his name. Oh, so it's like that? Lionel's coldness vanished, and he smiled lightly. Didn't you still try to kill me though? That's hard to forgive. Fuck you. You think I'm going to grovel at your feet? Die. Hephaestus attacked as swiftly and viciously as he could, his aura climbing to the point that the ground beneath his feet shattered. Quite a decent feat for someone in the fourth dimension to accomplish on a fifth-dimensional world. However, Lionel only chuckled and caught his wrist. All right. There's no need to throw a temper tantrum, right? I was just joking around. Lionel had used a bit of his coercion to force down Hephaestus' barriers and get him to tell the truth. But surprisingly, the truth was different from what he thought it would be. It could be considered to be a pleasant surprise, actually. Hephaestus kept attacking furiously, even trying with his legs and feet, but it was all to no avail. Lionel knocked him out and threw him over his shoulder, casually strolling to the pillars with a grown man hanging from his side. He placed a palm on the pillars, feeling the ancient carvings dance across his fingers. Yes, this could definitely work. Definitely, gross. Stop drooling, will you? In the spaceship above Planet Valiant, it was safe to say that Greta was seething. But at the same time, she didn't dare to go down. Contrary to what one might expect, this wasn't because she was afraid of Lionel, but rather that she didn't dare to show her face. If she did, things would only become even worse for the Milky Way Guild, which was already experiencing some trouble. At that moment, a welling up of dread filled her heart. She had already taken a risk by okaying this operation. Now not only had the three organizations suffered great losses, but among them 3 fifth-dimensional existences fell. As though that wasn't bad enough, she had lost 5 fifth-dimensional subordinates that she had worked hard to groom over the last several decades. There was no way that she could make up for such a loss to herself in a short time. None of this even mentioned the kind of punishment she would receive this time. Greta even began to think of running away. Maybe this time, if she dared to go back to the guild, she would really be finished. Was there any coming back from this? However, where would she go? To another galaxy? Traveling between galaxies required at least a 6th-dimensional ship, though. How would she procure such a thing? She definitely couldn't stay in the Milky Way. If she did, there wasn't a single corner she could hide in where she wouldn't be found. Fear began to flood Greta's heart, more and more crazed thoughts forcing her scar to tremble and wiggle about as though it had a mind of its own. She had to kill Lionel. That was the only way to survive. It was the only way to survive. It was exactly at that moment that Greta received a call. But when she heard the voice on the other side, she couldn't help but be frozen solid. Hello, little sister. Your big sis is here to save you. How about we make a deal? Chapter 9:18. Chapter 9:18. Blasted Open Sail stood in a training room, her expression quite blank. Dried streaks of tears left trails of salt down her cheeks, but she didn't seem to notice. She had lost count of how much time she had spent in this training room. It was quite funny. She had made so little progress despite how much time she had put it. At the same time, as much as she would miss Valiant Heart Mountain, she probably had the most memories in this place as opposed to any other. This bland, gray-walled, vacuous space. As for packing her things up, Sail realized that there really wasn't much to take. When it came to the resources, she decided to let those lesser than herself have those things. When it came to her personal things, all of the most important items were in her storage ring anyway. She just wanted to stand here. The speed was too fast, and with a swoosh, Wang Xian was pulled into the whirlpool, like a little crucian carp that had been hooked and was violently pulled out of the water. Sail forgot about the half-an-hour time limit, and just stood without a word for a length even she wasn't aware of. It wasn't until there was a sudden click at the door that she snapped away, turning her head over. But when she saw who it was, she simply looked away, her gaze remaining blank. "What do you want?" she asked. In her mind, she thought her voice would come off colder. But the reality was just that it sounded quite broken and hollow. She didn't have enough energy to put up a tough front. She just turned away, not facing the person. If you dare to fish against him like this, no matter if it's a strange thing on a mobile phone or that ferocious giant fish, you'll have to pay the price. This person was surprisingly Raylion. Are you done? He asked. The words in context sounded like he was asking about Sale's state of packing, but both of them knew quite well that Raylion was actually referring to something far deeper than just this. A fizzy is mocking him. Isn't that exactly what you wanted? Sale replied. For me to give up and hand everything to you? Well, now you've gotten your wish. Congratulations. Enjoy these empty walls none of us can protect. Raylion didn't answer for a long while as the two stood in silence. You aren't the woman I've been chasing after. Then it was noisy and motionless. Instead of reviving here, it chose to disguise it. The words were like a stone thrown into a still lake. They seemed to be layered with two meanings that made Sale tremble. All those years ago, Teacher Inkson chose you as his 15th disciple. I didn't say anything and just accepted it, even after he said that he would never take another. I've always been jealous of you. You are more talented than I am. You have more support than I do. And even though we are both without family, you at least have a little brother left while I have nothing. If one's piece of sword energy can't solve the problem, then take a few more pieces. Wang Xian is going to kill it. As much as you love Valiant Heart Mountain, I love it 10 times more. As much as this might pain you, it pains me 100 times more. As much as you want to give up, I want to give up 1,000 times more. But I haven't. Raylion turned to walk away. I really look down on you, Sale. Sale's shoulders shuddered, her eyes reddening as her dried tears threatened to burst forth once again. Lionel stood at the mountain pass, continuously drawing in the air with a finger. Every swipe he made seemed to carry a unique air to it. If it wasn't for the fact he was carrying a grown man over his shoulder, he might have even looked to be quite enigmatic. An odd force began to follow the flow of Lionel's finger. It was an extremely pale violet that was difficult to spot with the high sun above their heads like this. And it didn't seem intent on growing any brighter. Even Lionel himself could only gain a faint glimpse of it. To others, it might not seem to be there at all. Lionel had spent a long time thinking about how to strengthen his mage arts. But he realized that his thinking had been far too rigid in this regard. Whenever he prepared to create a mage art, his first thought would be about the practicality of the element and what it could accomplish. For example, the light element was good for healing, the star element was quite hefty and good for energy, etc., etc. But after seeing the lotus of arms and hands, Lionel realized that his thinking was lacking. He thought to himself, if he had the wood element as an affinity, how would he use it? Would he be able to create such a powerful result? The answer to that was no. He probably wouldn't even consider using the wood element to attack. He would use it for area control, and at most use it for life-stealing. However, he would never even consider the possibility that it could create such flexible, powerful attacks. It was then that he realized what he was missing. Grand Bell Construct had been one of the most powerful defensive spells Lionel had. But why was its shape important? Why was it a bell and not a shield or a dome? Why was it that if Lionel tried to change its form, it would weaken? Lionel's conclusion was that there was an underlying natural force to the substance of an object. Wasn't this where universal force originated from? It was the comprehension of one of the most natural and ubiquitous cycles of the dimensional verse. Reflecting the four-season or heavenly bodies in one's comprehension gave a tangible boost to one's strength. But who was to say that these cycles were the only things that held such a power? What if Grand Bell Construct was so powerful because it embodied the essence of an ancient bell? What if his snowy star owl's instant recovery was so powerful because it embodied the essence of a mythical creature? What if he started forming spells not from scratch, but rather using natural phenomena and powerful treasures of the dimensional verse instead? The possibilities were endless when he thought of things this way. He could imagine fire arts created from powerful mythical creatures. He could imagine star arts formed by observing real stars. He could imagine using medicinal herbs to form recovery arts. He could even imagine space arts created from observing void beasts, Just what kind of result would that have? And right now, observing the force arts that formed this pillar, Lionel felt like he was on the verge of creating a spell so powerful it even made him shudder. A world of fifth-dimensional mage arts had been blasted wide open. Chapter 919. Chapter 919. Something within Lionel clicked. If one looked within his dream world, it would be possible to find a partially complete dream sculpt of the Valiant Pillars. The truth was that the Valiant Pillars weren't a simple treasure. They had aspects far above the fifth dimension to their design, and obviously Lionel didn't have the time to dream sculpt all of it, nor would there be a point to. After all, in his current state, the best mage arts he could use would be in the fifth dimension. Luckily, Lionel's skill in dream sculpt had increased. He was able to lower the resolution of portions that would slow his progress, and sculpt the parts he needed in the highest resolution possible. This technique not only allowed him to dream sculpt things with greater speed, but it also left him with just enough information to go back and complete the dream sculpt later should he need it, using the parts of lower resolution to deduce a higher resolution result. The speed was too fast, and with a swoosh, Wang Xian was pulled into the whirlpool, like a little crucian carp that had been hooked and was violently pulled out of the water. This dream sculpt had been completed by Lionel long ago. In the past several minutes, he had been using it as the foundation for a new mage art, his finger continuously sweeping through the air. Fascinating. King's Might makes it easier for me to see through the essence of something and capture what makes it it. Then these mage arts would probably benefit from having King's Might incorporated into them. Lionel took a deep breath. Valiant Seal. If you dare to fish against him like this, no matter if it's a strange thing on a mobile phone, or that ferocious giant fish, you'll have to pay the price. In that moment, all the wind of the world seemed to freeze as though time itself had come to a halt. The air itself solidified, compressing onto itself in layers and making it harder and harder to move. Just then, the ground began to tremble. Something began to rise from beneath the surface, forming a dome of earth at first, and quickly refining itself into a polished cylindrical construct. The moment this odd pillar began to manifest, the impact on the world it had accelerated. By this point, the green leaves of trees stopped swaying, the grass no longer rustled, and even the lava that had been flowing in the area came to a grinding halt, not moving forward a single inch more. A fizzy is mocking him. The pillar had only risen half a foot out of the ground when Lionel cut his force off, forcing the spine-tingling phenomena to come to a stop. Lionel coughed, his charred organs acting up again. Toward this, he could only shake his head. If he was still in the fourth dimension of his metal body, he could probably try absorbing some star core, refractive gold or blazing night to heal himself. But he had already broken into the fifth. He wasn't sure if those fourth-dimensional ores would still have the impact he wanted. Then it was noisy and motionless. Instead of reviving here, it chose to disguise it. The good news, though, was that those combination of ores had indeed helped his body to withstand his Scarlet Star force a bit better. If not for this, his metal body, which currently couldn't even truly be considered Tier 1, wouldn't stand a chance. I need to find fifth-dimensional ores very soon. I also need to heal myself. It seems that the Force Crafting Guild really is the place I have to go. But maybe Lionel narrowed his eyes. His experience with creating Valiant Seal taught him a few things. If one's piece of sword energy can't solve the problem, then take a few more pieces. Wang Xian is going to kill it. First, with a reference to work with, creating new mage arts was far easier and tens of times faster. This was probably the inverse for someone else. But for Lionel, who had his dream sculpt ability, it wasn't a problem in the slightest. In fact, it could be said that Lionel practically had a cheat code toward creating mage arts now. The second thing he learned, which was a proxy to the first, was that these mage arts he created would be far more powerful, not to mention having far less drain on his stamina. This latter conclusion was a surprise to Lionel, but he came to understand after a moment. When Lionel deduced the creation of new mage arts, he was building something from the ground up. In addition, though he could streamline the process later, this would often weaken the effective result of the mage art. Lionel's attempts at building mage arts from the ground up resulted in overly elaborate, though quite beautiful and intricate, constructs. Unfortunately, that made it so that they took time and effort to draw in battle. To Lionel, it was still possible due to his abilities. But just because he could do it didn't mean that he should, even if he could often quickly replenish the dream force he used thanks to his stars. However, now with King's Might involved, Lionel only had to use half the dream force he would have to otherwise. Coupling that with a far less complex mage art overall, and this resulted in an added ease that could be measured in tens of times. Of course, this was only in comparison to if Lionel had to build up a mage art from scratch that accomplished the same goal. Just now, Lionel had felt that if he completed the cast of Valiant Seal, it would have taken up 10% of his stamina, and that was just with the formation of one pillar. He had already calculated that for the best, foolproof method of use, he would need to form 4 pillars. That meant a single cast of Valiant Seal would take almost half of his stamina up. And that was the simplest form of Valiant Seal, with much of its more complex portion drawn out in low resolution. On the other hand, if he used his original method, he would have needed to wait until he reached the peak of the 5th dimension to even dream of casting it at all. If that was the case, what Lionel needed to think of wasn't new mage arts to use, but he rather needed valuable references that were worth him creating mage arts based off on. With a thought, Lionel took out a special herb he had had with him for years. Back during the Hive Island event, he managed to plunder this herb, 3-vein mending weed. Lionel remembered his curiosity back then quite well. He wondered if he could incorporate the natural force arts of this quasi-black grade herb into his armor to give it self-healing properties. Of course, back then, he hadn't known enough about his divine armor to know that it was naturally ingrained with such an ability to begin with. Now that he thought about it, he had definitely been really close to using nature as his muse back then. This was just a quasi-black grade herb, but it was a good test to see just how powerful this new method of force art creation was. Chapter 920. Chapter 920. Lionel didn't have to dream sculpt this herb. He had already done so back then, and it took him an entire 2 days. Of course, it would only take him a split second now, but that hardly mattered. Lionel closed his eyes for a moment before they flashed open. Mending light. Lionel's body suddenly began to glow as crisscross patterns of what looked like blade marks erupted across him. One could have thought that some sort of light elemental swordsman had instantly cut him into 1,000 pieces before retracting his blade. Soon, the patterns solidified and sunk into Lionel's body, like some sort of binding rope. Even Lionel couldn't help but be fascinated by the method the mage art took. Usually, when he built mage arts from the ground up, he would know exactly how it would function before he cast it. But this form of mage arts gave him little surprises from time to time. I wonder, no 2 herbs are identical. What would happen if I had used a different herb of this exact same species? Would the pattern be different? Lionel was completely intrigued. It took him a moment to actually begin analyzing the results. The impact was minimal, but the fact there was a slight change at all is shocking enough. That was a 3rd-dimensional mage art, yet it still had some impact, though some of that is because it was created with 5th-dimensional light force. There's a glaring problem though. The 3-vein mending weed is a wood elemental herb. Using it as the basis of a light elemental art is already handicapping it. I not only need to find a stronger herb as a foundation, it also needs to be one that fits with the affinities I have. This was the 3rd thing Lionel realized. He couldn't just use any reference. Why was his Valiant Seal so powerful? It was because he had the appropriate earth and space elemental affinities. In fact, because his space affinity was reliant on his divine armor. If he ever chose to build a divine armor with a different element, he likely would never be able to reach the full potential of Valiant Seal. That was something he needed to be aware of. This path. It's excellent. Lionel found himself to be quite excited about this. But at the same time, the dread of missing out creeped back up again. If he hadn't run into the head of Misty Woods, and he hadn't been forced to use his religion in a bid against him, how long would it have taken Lionel to have this breakthrough? There was just so much of this world that he had no idea about. Holding myself up and thinking of ways to accelerate my strength will never work. I need to experience the world. A groggy voice suddenly caught Lionel's attention. Hey, what the hell is this? Let me down. Let me down right. Lionel let Hephaestus go, causing the latter to fall right onto his large nose. It was safe to say that Hephaestus was furious. First he had been humiliated by Lionel. Then he had been easily defeated. Then, as though that wasn't bad enough, he was held up like a sack of potatoes, then dropped to the ground like trash. He jumped to his feet. Though his nose wasn't broken, as it would take far more than just that to harm his body, it still began to bleed, making his fury funnier than it should be. Just when Hephaestus was going to implode, he and Lionel both noticed a figure descending from the skies. Flying was a difficult thing to do unless you had an ability or a treasure that helped you. Clearly, this person was among the former group and had an ability. It didn't take long for Lionel to realize that it was Raylion. Raylion touched down to the ground, standing exactly 2 meters from Lionel and the furious Hephaestus. He was just as apathetic as ever. This was the same expression he had worn even after Aina had beaten him all those months ago. He just seemed unmoved by most things. Let's go, Hephaestus. Ah. But Hephaestus had gone through all that trouble to lower himself and ask Lionel to let them join all so that Raylion didn't have to do the same. But clearly Raylion still had no intention of staying like this. Raylion didn't say anything to convince Hephaestus. He simply turned and walked away. Hephaestus let out a deep sigh. He knew that there wasn't anyone more prideful than Raylion. Or maybe there was. But he had just yet to meet the person. Even against such odds, he had no intention of bending a knee. Hephaestus swept a glance at Lionel, half pleading. But it soon became obvious to him that Lionel had no intention of saying anything either. He felt a flash of hatred for Lionel, but it was quickly overwhelmed by helplessness. Why would the potential heir of such a powerful family care about them enough to lower his pride for their sake? He probably thought Raylion's so-called pride to be nothing more than a joke. Hephaestus clenched his fists and his canines nearly shattered as his jaw trembled. They hadn't known previously that Lionel had such a strong background. Ingson and Hutchin had only recently let it slip. Their meaning had been clear. They hoped that some of them would be taken under Lionel's wing. But Sale was broken. Raylion was too prideful. And he wanted to stay by Raylion's side. That was his brother. He couldn't leave him for greener grass now. Hephaestus turned and walked away, his poor posture straightening in a rare instance. I need information. The voice came suddenly and out of nowhere. It was clearly from Lionel, but when Hephaestus' head snapped back, Lionel was already no longer there. And I need a lot of it. The voice rang again. Raylion didn't seem to have stopped his steps for even a moment. But if one could gaze into his eyes, it would be possible to witness a blazing fire. Chapter 921. Chapter 921. Bureaucracy. The Force Crafting Guild was a place of abject luxury. Every tree, every blade of grass, every paved road, and every crystal-clear window was immaculately sculpted. Not a single thing was out of place, and the pompousness could almost be smelled through the air. Although Lionel had never been to the capital of Earth while war wasn't raging, he had always imagined that it was like this. However, even to his imagination, this place felt like a bit too much of an exaggeration. Every person he passed by seemed to want to make sure that their status was plastered for all to see. They wore their badges prominent to one chest and their affiliations just as proudly to the other. Their noses were practically so high in the air that they didn't even bother to look down on Lionel for dressing so casually. How could they? Their gazes were enraptured by the skies above. It was a miracle that they weren't constantly bumping into one another on the road. Clearly they weren't looking where they were going to begin with. It could be said that the only good thing about this place was that the air was exceptionally pure and clean. There was even a slight fragrance to it that reminded Lionel of a bakery, but it also wasn't overwhelming to the point it was taking up all of his senses. In fact, it was barely noticeable at all. That, though, was where all the good stopped. The moment he had stepped foot into this place, he had been under scrutiny. First, at the gates, he was scanned from top to bottom. The check was even more invasive since he didn't have a crafter's badge or an affiliation to name. They checked everything from his age to his dimension level, and at some point he was certain the formation they had active took a scan of his teeth, as though they might need to identify him when he died. After dealing with that ridiculousness, He needed to deal with filling out a questionnaire that would put any security detail at an airport to shame. Not only did he need to state his purpose, how long he would be here, etc., there was even questions asking him about how often he might need to use the bathroom. When he asked the attendant why they were asking such ridiculous questions, he received an answer from a completely straight-faced lady that said, "We don't want needless waste from outsiders." It was like they thought Lionel taking a dump would shift their ecosystem for the worst. But now that they were being so insistent, Lionel almost wanted to lay a deuce for the ages. He had never seen a place more pompous in his life. It made him feel the urge to piss from some tall walls. He had wondered why even his father's training program hardly mentioned the force crafting guilds, and now he had a pretty good idea why. Lionel still remembered clearly the killing intent in his father's eyes when he mentioned treating little Tali like a friend and companion, not a tool. That fury had to stem from somewhere, and if Lionel had to guess, it was most definitely from this place. Halt! This region is for crafters alone. Common citizens are not allowed to step foot into this region. Tall guards wearing the most ridiculous golden armor, stunted with diamond Lionel had ever seen stopped his forward progress. Shaking his head, Lionel presented his documents. He had already gone through all that trouble of filling out those papers, something that had taken up almost 12 hours of his time, so he wouldn't run into trouble later. At least now it was all prepared and ready. He just wanted to get this over with as soon as possible. After all, he was still in constant pain. Having your inner organs charred to near ash was not a good feeling. If he wasn't dulling the pain with dream sense, he might not even be standing right now. "I've come to take my force crafter exam." Lionel spoke. The guards, each of whom was difficult to look at straight due to how blinding their armor was, looked Lionel up and down. As though seeing him for the first time, they scrutinized his clothing and demeanor. It became clear quite quickly that they weren't impressed with what they saw. One of the guards was about to speak when another pressed a hand to his chest, stopping him. The two made eye contact, and a look of realization dawned upon the latter as though he suddenly remembered something. "The Force Crafter exam won't be taking place today. Come again another time." What? Lionel was stunned. He wasn't paying very much attention to the actions of the guards because he thought it was all just a formality. But when he heard these words, he was stunned. Lionel had just gone through customs to enter this city. According to all the stuff he had filled out, that was his purpose in this place. With how strict the rules were, if he couldn't become an official force crafter, he wouldn't be allowed to stay. But if he wasn't allowed to stay, that would mean he would have to come back and repeat this process all over again tomorrow. Not only would that mean another day of this pain in his organs, it would also mean that he would have to use another 12 hours to go through all that bureaucracy once again. As though that wasn't bad enough, who's to say they would even allow him through this time? He had read through the entire sheet, and there was a question about how often he had visited the Force Crafting Guild city in the past. Lionel had no doubt that the fact his answer was 0 weighed in favor of him entering. What if there was a hidden cap on the number of times individuals could enter this place? Wouldn't he be screwed then? Lionel's gaze turned cold when he thought through all of this. Why? Chapter 922. Chapter 922. Charges. The guards were stunned by Lionel's question. Were they being doubted? The two suddenly began to look around as though to check whether or not they were in a dream world. Seeing the individuals walking around, some of which had actually noticed that something was off only to begin observing, they quickly came to the realization that they were indeed not in a dream. Some Tier 1 fool was actually questioning them. Lionel stood in silence, his gaze carrying with it a hint of cold. However, without even answering, the sound of tearing paper resonated through the gate entrance. Lionel could only watch as the documents it had taken him half a day to earn were torn to pieces. His gaze followed the fluttering pieces of paper as they were whisked away by the wind. The guard who acted seemed intent on staring him down as he tore the documents into smaller and smaller pieces, trying to humiliate Lionel to the greatest extent. It was as though they were eager for Lionel to snap, waiting for him to attack, so that they'd have all the reason in the world to teach him a more physical lesson. The Force Crafter's exam will not be taking place today. Come again another time. The words were repeated by the sneering guard. If you can, that is. The spectators watched on in curiosity, some who were even waiting to enter the guild after Lionel, rolling their lips over one another as though to hold themselves back from laughing. One of the first rules anyone who came to this planet would learn was the importance of status. The second rule they would learn was the importance of not offending those your status couldn't be above. As long as you followed these two rules, even if you were trampled all over, you would at least be left with a small bit of a face. The question was if you were willing or able to protect this small bit and go about your merry way. Over the years, there weren't a small number of individuals who hadn't managed to control their anger. However, each one of them had a more miserable ending than the last. By now, it had already been a very long time since anyone tried to stir up trouble. Or, at the very least, it had been a very long time since anyone who dared to cause trouble actually managed to stir up any waves. Usually, such people would end up like Lionel here, having barely gotten a question out before suddenly and harshly being ruthlessly suppressed without even room to breathe. Lionel didn't say a word as the guards continued to sneer. What are your names? The second question came out of nowhere, almost like the first. In fact, it stunned the two guards once more before the one who tore up the documents began to laugh uproariously. Who the hell are you to ask for our names? Didn't you hear me earlier? Scram. The second guard laughed, maybe even harder than the first. No. Hold on. The little guy must be thinking of revenge. How about we give him some hope, Rio? My name is Xander. Now that you know, what are you going to do about it? I'll give you 3 seconds before we throw you out of here. Xander already had at least 3 charges he could drop on Lionel's head. With how harsh the punishment was in the guild's territory, this alone would be able to get him locked away for years, not to mention being pinned with an additional ban, even after he got out. He couldn't help but chuckle as he thought of how this bastard was just ruining himself, because he didn't know how to control his rage. What Xander and Rio didn't know, though, was that if Lionel really wasn't able to control his anger, they would already be dead. Lionel didn't even look them in the eye as they reported their names. He stretched out a finger, causing dozens of thin strings of neutral force to connect with the fluttering torn pieces of document. The moment these force strings connected, the papers vanished into Lionel's spatial ring. Xander and Rio put on odd expressions when they saw this. What was the point of that exactly? They were more baffled by the action and didn't even register just how much skill it would have taken to replicate what Lionel had just done. Do you know how many monitoring force arts there are in this region? Xander? Rio. Lionel asked a third question. The two guards frowned, but this time, Lionel didn't let them answer as he began to point. There's one at every street corner. Given their scopes, there were 4 that had a vantage point toward this location. There are 2 at the top of this very gate. That makes 6. And finally, there's my own, making 7 in total. Lionel finally looked up again. But even when his gaze met theirs, it felt as though he was seeing right through them, as though they weren't truly worthy of him gazing upon them. Do you know why I bothered to tell you all of this? The reason is quite simple. Lionel's fingers flipped over, suddenly revealing a piece of torn paper pinched between 2 of them. On this torn piece of paper, there was a symbol that looked like it had just been freshly stamped. Clearly, it was an authentication seal, something that represented the guild's bureaucracy department. What do you think the punishment for destroying government documents is, exactly? The 2 guards froze. Back in a certain office, a young woman with a cold expression sat at her desk, reviewing some things. She had her hair up in a neat bun without even a single strand out of place and skin-tight office clothing that clung tightly to her curvaceous body. However, with her expression, it was hard for anyone to sexualize her. Suddenly she froze. He was approved? How? That should be impossible. Before the young woman could even investigate, a man with an expression just as cold walked into her office. Chapter 923. Chapter 923, Bad Luck, Amori. What is the meaning of this? The stoic middle-aged man stood before the cold young woman, his expression even colder than it usually was. Amori, who had just been delving deep into her own thoughts, was thrown completely off guard by this line of questioning. She hurriedly stood to display her respect, But this didn't help her understand what her superior was getting at. Sir Ingnerl. Amori's back stood tall and straight, as though she was a soldier rather than the office worker she truly was. She was maybe a bit too eager in her actions because her button-down shirt almost threatened to burst. Luckily, the material was flexible and durable enough to hold up. Ingnerl, though, didn't seem to notice this in the slightest. Instead, he pulled out a tablet that looked as though it was pulled right from Earth's technological age. And yet, when one looked at its screen, there were nothing but floating force art nodes. It was impossible for a layman to understand just what it was that they were seeing. But Ingnerl read through it as though it was written in plain and simple English. According to this, there was an indefinite visa approved for entry into the guild's territory today. Didn't I tell you that all such processes should be stopped? This is a sensitive time. Only those who had already been accepted into an affiliation should be allowed here at this time. You don't usually make such mistakes. What is happening? Amori blinked in shock. So, it really was about that. Sir, I did everything according to your orders. But it would cause problems if everyone who came was simply turned away. So subordinate adjusted the entry requirements to make it so that it should be impossible to enter. Subordinate has no idea how one slipped through. I triple and quadruple checked the algorithm. Ingnerl frowned. Though Amori didn't follow what he asked her to do exactly, this was part of the reason she had risen through the ranks so quickly. She understood how to not only follow orders, but how to also choose the best method to do so as well. In this case, she was once again thinking of the larger picture. The Force Crafting Guild was already labeled as quite uppity and noble by outside sources. It was just that they provided such a necessary service, and they were so powerful that the quibbles of the commoners hardly mattered. However, even for their guild, simply turning everyone away without cause or reason would breed more resentment than they were willing to handle. After all, they were just a small branch of the main guild. Even if they enraged all the powers in this region and ended up getting destroyed, there was little the main guild would be able to do. Of course, getting revenge for the main guild would be as easy as snapping a finger. But by then they would already be dead. So, how would that help them? To make matters worse, it was unlikely that the powers in this region would do such a thing. It was more likely that they would try to suppress the guild in various ways, and that would be even more annoying to deal with. In truth, the odds of these things happening was very small. But there were always a few madmen who couldn't understand logic and reason, only to go about doing as they pleased anyway. Though these madmen would often suffer terrible fates, it wasn't like their victims could come back to life. This was all to say that maintaining a balance, and at least a facade of fairness, wasn't a bad idea for the longevity of the guild in this region. So rather than just turning everyone away due to the special guests they were receiving, Amori decided to modify the algorithm that decided whether a visa would be granted or not to make it so that it would be impossible for anyone to be granted access. And yet, somehow, Lionel was still approved. Show me his documents. Ingnerl said coldly. Yes, sir. Amori reacted quickly, finding Lionel Morales and passing everything on to her superior. She had just been about to look through them after realizing what happened. But she suppressed her curiosity. Ingnerl flipped through Lionel's answers, realizing that each one only got more and more sarcastic as he went on. He could almost feel Lionel's contempt for them all, and yet he didn't miss even a single line. Ingnerl had turned his fair share of people away for accidentally missing questions, and most of them had been annoyed with the long process like Lionel. Yet Lionel himself hadn't made this mistake. There's nothing special about these answers. Could it be a mistake with Amori's change to the algorithm? But that was unlikely with her thoroughness. In addition, there were 10,877 people who tried to gain entry today. Yet only one of them got through? If it was a problem with the algorithm, there would have been more than this. Unless, Ingnerl suddenly threw of a possibility. Give me his biometrics. Amori was stunned. Biometrics were saved and stored. But once again, to protect against public outrage, there was a large burden that needed to be proven to allow them to be accessed. After all, no one wanted themselves to be laid bare like this just to visit a place. But this was the way of the world. Rules were only for the weak. Ingnerl got his hands on everything from Lionel's teeth x-rays to his blood samples. What he saw made him widen his eyes. By the end of it, his pupils simply couldn't constrict any further. What bad luck. A talent like this shouldn't be in this galaxy. Where did he come from? And why on this day of them all? What he saw could all be summed up in 2 lines. Age, 21 dimension, Tier 1, 5th. Before Ignaro could even think of making a decision, his tablet vibrated and a voice began to speak. Ignaro, Lady Anya is prepared to take her Force Crafter's exam. Chapter 924. Chapter 924, Blood. Mercury Lionel stood before the gates indifferently. Did he think that this would be enough to make it in? Quite frankly, he doubted it. However, he had to try no matter what. The truth of the matter was that the greatest issue he was facing weren't his injuries, or even the time it would take to go through this process all over again. Of course, these things were major problems, but they weren't existential. The main issue was that this might be one of the only chances he ever got to enter the guild normally. Lionel hadn't forgotten that he was still a wanted criminal. The universe was just so large that enforcing such things was difficult, especially when the information had been suppressed by those who put out his warrant to begin with. However, Lionel wasn't a fool. There was still very much a chance that he would be exposed soon. When that time came, this matter would only blow up all the more. By then, he wouldn't have a chance to exchange 12 hours for entry into this place at all, even if he was willing. He had to take this opportunity while his name and face weren't known galaxy-wide to accomplish some things, or else he would just ram headfirst into trouble wherever he went. If Lionel had to point out what his goals were right now, it was to place down a solid foothold in the Milky Way that extended beyond what he could build on Earth. He didn't know why, at least it wasn't something he could put into words. But for some reason, he innately saw his own grandfather as competition. He saw Earth as a place to be conquered, not as a power backing him. Looking at things this way, Lionel was on his own. But he wasn't aimless. Since the Milky Way Guild was targeting him, he didn't mind sacrificing it toward his goals. What better way to lay a foundation than to use the resources of the largest merchant guild in the galaxy? This was all to say that Lionel couldn't be stalled here, not now. For all he knew, Shield Cross Stars was already aware of his appearance here. He didn't know how deep their hooks had sunk into this galaxy, but he had to be cautious. Just as Lionel was fully prepared for the worst-case scenario, a commotion to his back never allowed the guards to reply to his hardly veiled threat. Turning back, Lionel found a carriage of white wood and golden leaves being pulled along by a white steed. The beast's limbs were powerful, and its mane was long and pristinely tailored. In truth, it felt as though the beast had stepped right out of fairy tale. The only thing it was missing was a horn, and Lionel would believe he had been teleported into another mythological zone. This one being for Cinderella. However, though this horse looked like a relatively normal horse Lionel would even be able to find on Earth, this was only on the surface. Lionel could sense that its blood was very heavy, rushing through its veins like mercury. Its eyes didn't seem to be formed of flesh, but rather of an intangible light that floated within their sockets. And most shocking of all, this steed was within the quasi-sixth dimension, and yet it was only tasked with pulling a carriage. That carriage is a silver treasure. The longer Lionel observed, the more ridiculous it all seemed to become. Carriages weren't exactly frequently seen, especially not on this planet. As one might have expected, those who were allowed vehicles were those of high standing, and most of them chose to travel through the air in sleek, top-of-the-line shuttles. Everyone else had to use their own 2 feet. Only when it was necessary to cross large distances would they use convenient teleportation hubs drawn from force arts. This was to say that this carriage was the only one on the streets, and its destination was also quite clear. The expressions of Xander and Rio changed. "Get out the way, move, move." Rio barked at both Lionel and the others lining up behind him. Currently, there was a queue waiting to enter the main territory of the guild. Of these queues there were 2. One door for those who could enter and exit the main guild freely, and a second for those like Lionel who had more special circumstances. These 2 doors were only small side entrances to the main gate. However, in order to open the main gate, both doors had to be closed and the mechanisms had to be activated. Obviously, Whoever could ride in a silver-grade treasure pulled along by a quasi-sixth-dimensional beast couldn't possibly use a side entrance to enter the guild. Xander and Rio hadn't expected the special guest to come so early on, so they were already shouting orders. Truthfully, most hadn't needed their warnings. They knew their place well. They had no intention of getting in the way of such a big shot. However, Lionel didn't move an inch. He stood in the middle of the gates, as though they were being prepared to be opened for him and him alone. "Did you not hear what we said?" Scram. This was their last chance to scare Lionel away. They couldn't show such an unsightly appearance to this guest. They had been warned so many times that everything needed to be perfect. This was why they couldn't allow Lionel into the guild. And yet, this bastard was still causing trouble. They immediately unleashed their strength, bearing down on Lionel, as though to show him that they weren't joking. Unfortunately for them, other than a slight fluttering of his hair, Lionel was completely unmoved. Both Xander and Rio were tier 4, making them quite powerful, truth be told. But Lionel had killed 4 such experts just yesterday. The horse and carriage continued to move forward. The oppressive pressure of the steed alone made Xander and Rio shiver, fear lighting their eyes. Lionel might not know the exact species of this steed, but they did. The Blood Mercury race. A steed with the temper of a demon and the patience of a lit fuse. And now, it was too late to get out of its way. Lionel felt a billowing heat suddenly blow down the back of his neck. Chapter 925. Chapter 925. Lady Anya. Lionel's hair wafted beneath the wind. He could tell that if it wasn't for his innate fire elemental affinity, this breath alone might have been enough to scorch his skin. He turned back, an indifferent look lighting his eyes. It was as though he couldn't see the fear in the guards nor the surrounding experts. When Lionel's gaze met the steed's, the latter trembled slightly, its nostrils flaring and its body tensing. For some reason, this steed felt a large amount of pressure from Lionel. It wasn't the kind of pressure that said Lionel was stronger than it, but rather just the kind of pressure that said it should be afraid. It was a very subtle difference, almost like it was looking at what Lionel might become rather than what he was. There were many races of people in the dimensional verse, humans and the Oryx being just 2 that Lionel had met to this point. However, there was a large dividing line between species, and this dividing line was humanoid versus bestial. Humanoid races of people like humans and Oryx evolve more to rely on their active abilities, and their talent was more malleable. But the consequence of this is that there are more untalented humans than there are talented ones. Bestial races evolve to rely on their innate abilities and their talent is far less malleable. However, this likewise means that there are more talented beasts than there are humanoids. This major dividing line of knowing how to take and accepting what is given is maybe the most fundamental diverging path of evolution the dimensional verse had to offer, from which there were a myriad of differences that could be deduced. One such difference was that the instinct of bestial races happened to be far sharper than humanoid races. As such, this steed of the Blood Mercury race was very much in tune with how much fear it should have for Lionel, and was thus far more prepared to act on it compared to humans. Lionel, who had been indifferent, suddenly smiled and reached out a hand. Under the stunned gazes of those watching, Lionel stroked the horse's jaw. At first, the steed trembled as though afraid that Lionel would harm it. But when it sensed that Lionel had no ill intent, it neighed lightly, nudging at Lionel's hand. Xander and Rio were frozen in shock. Was this a horse of the Blood Mercury race? Weren't they known for their fiery tempers? Weren't they able to stomp a mountain to rubble with a single hoof and disperse the clouds with a single neigh? What the hell was going on here? Little White? Is something the matter? At that moment, a sudden voice rang out. It was so melodious and sweet that silence almost fell, the only thing gracing their ears being the flute-like whistling of the wind as though it too wanted to show its appreciation. Lionel couldn't help but look up and toward the carriage. In his life, he had only heard one other voice comparable. Suddenly hearing such a thing now caught him somewhat off guard. This voice didn't carry the same innate coercion, but something told Lionel that this was only because she was able to control it better. And even without this coercion, even without seeing her face, one could already feel the innate want and need to protect her. Just from this voice alone, Lionel could tell that this woman within the carriage was powerful. It had to be said that the carriage itself didn't have a driver, nor were there any windows. Clearly, this blood mercury steed had more than enough intelligence of its own to find its destination on its own. But it was exactly because of this that the sudden and abrupt stop was out of the young woman's expectations. The guards suddenly snapped out of their shock and remembered their duty. However, by the time they wanted to figure out a path to take out of this so that they could avoid blame, the clicking sound of the carriage's doors opened, and then they all witnessed the descent of a goddess. The first thing any of them saw was the hem of her long, white dress, so long in fact that it completely masked her feet, leaving it all to their imagination. The dress itself was quite plain and wasn't overly embroidered, but despite how loose it was around her legs, it still couldn't help but cling slightly to her hips. When the young woman's head dipped out of the carriage, it was like a refreshing breeze whistled through the world. The sun seemed dimmer, the skies more somber, even the beautiful streets of the guild paled, unable to match up. And this was all despite the fact this young woman wore a veil. Her long white hair fluttered, disappearing into the folds of her dress. A pair of golden eyes looked around curiously, an innocent twinkling within their depths that made one hope no harm would ever come to her. The only patches of her soft, fair skin one could see were upon her forehead and her slender, swan-like neck, and yet it was still enough to entice the masses. The young woman blinked when she saw Lionel petting her horse. She knew well the kind of temper her little white had. It didn't even allow others to get close, let alone touch her. This was a shocking scene indeed. "Ah, Lady Anya. I'm sorry for failing to greet you." At that moment, several powerful auras surged out from the guild, each wearing aggrieved expressions as the large gates were finally opened wide. This Lady Anya was really too difficult to get a read on. She had just informed them minutes ago that she wanted to take her exam now, yet she was already here. She didn't give them time to prepare much of anything. All this time, though, Lady Anya, who was still part descended and part not from her carriage, continued to look at Lionel with an almost childlike curiosity in her eyes. "Who are you? Why are you in Lady Anya's way?" One of the elders immediately snapped upon seeing Lionel's back, her aura bearing down with the pressure of a Tier 7 existence as though she had every intention of slaughtering him where he stood. Chapter 926. Chapter 926, Justice. The aura washed through the streets. The spectators felt as though their hearts were suddenly caught in their throats, and the two guards, Xander and Rio, caught in the line of fire, almost wanted to prostrate themselves to the ground. Everyone seemed to look toward Lionel, who must have been feeling the brunt of it. Some had expressions of subterfuge, others pity, and others were just focused on staying out of it, not wanting to get dragged into this mess. However, what no one expected was for Lionel to suddenly look back and gaze toward the older woman who had yelled at him as though he was seeing a savior. "Ah, you finally came. I really need your help." Lionel dashed to stand before the woman, ignoring the beautiful Lady Anya and Little White. Among the two of them, though, it seemed that Little White was the most dissatisfied with Lionel's departure, as she was very much enjoying being pet. Lionel stood before the older woman with a half-pleading expression, as though a child seeking out his grandmother for being wronged. Obviously, the older woman had no security to speak of. After all, even though crafters usually had poor combat prowess, they were also known for having various crafts to make up for that gap. If there was any singular group of people with the most trump cards in the world, it was definitely a force crafter. And more specifically, a force crafter who was nearing the end of their lifespan and had little else to do but tinker in hopes of a breakthrough. Plus, the older woman was a Tier 7 existence. She wasn't under any threat from anyone. Even the guards of the guild should be afraid of her. The only reason she was even making a public appearance now was due to Lady Anya's own appearance. This was all to say that not only was there no one who blocked Lionel, but there was also no one even in position to block him to begin with. In the blink of an eye, he had appeared before the older woman. Due to their difference in height, he was practically towering over her. And yet he still managed to seem like the harmless child in this exchange. "Ma'am, you seem to be very powerful and have high standing, right? Then I ask that you please administer justice for me." I just spent the last half day going through customs, and this is my first time in the guild's territory. I have to say that I'm in awe of its beauty and grandeur, and up until the moment I reached the gates, I was enthusiastic and excited to become a great crafter. However, when I got to the gates and presented my documents, these 2 guards here actually tore them up. I was appalled. The dignity of the guild was actually being blasphemed in such a way. Even 2 guards dared to simply shred its prestige in the face of so many eyewitnesses. I have to say that I've never felt more terrible. Even my heart aches. I was told that the Force Crafting Guild was the best place to be for my future, that it was a place where anyone could become a crafter so long as you had the skill. But I was turned away just because I wanted to take the Force Crafter's exam. These 2, Xander and Rio, even implied that they'd turn me away every time I came. Please help me. Lionel's voice was imploring and moving. It even looked like he might shed a real tear at any moment. On top of that, he had spoken so quickly and with such conviction and clarity that despite being stunned, the old woman who had had every intention of blowing her top could only be shocked to the point of deflating like a balloon. It was clear that even she couldn't ignore the slight coercion in Lionel's voice. In fact, many of those who were listening, even when they had been sneering before, suddenly felt the need to feel bad for him. If the old woman had gathered her thoughts first, maybe she would have had a different reaction. But seeing Lionel's plea and how he suddenly swung his body to point toward the 2 pale guards, she spoke before she even realized what was happening. Is what he says true? The old woman regretted her words almost instantly. This wasn't what she should have asked. She should have pretended that Lionel was speaking nonsense and told him to scram. Maybe even find a trumped-up charge to have him arrested or banned from their world. However, since she asked this, she had opened up a can of worms. Damn it. Deny it. Deny it, you fools. The old woman screamed in her mind. Xander and Rio, having no idea what the old woman was thinking, panicked. All they could remember was Lionel pointing out all of the cameras, not to mention pointing out that he had recorded the event personally as well. How could they assume that the older woman would be willing to lie for them? They both thought they were caught. They only hoped that by telling the truth, they could get a lesser punishment. The 2 lowered their heads and gripped their fists. Why, yes. It's true. You. The older woman pointed a wrinkled finger toward the both of them. To outsiders, it looked as though she was enraged by their foul conduct. But the reality was that she was infuriated by the fact they hadn't dared to be foul enough. How was she supposed to deal with this situation now? Not only had their branch guild made a terrible first impression, but in order to save some face, she might even have to extend some sort of olive branch to this troublemaker. She practically seared Lionel's face into her memories. She was already thinking of several ways to make Lionel's life a living hell. Since he wanted to be in the guild so bad, she would show him what it meant to be in the guild. Chapter 927. Chapter 927, who said? Just when the older woman was about to reach a decision for what to do, a sudden aura approached. Ingnerl appeared in their midst not long later, scanning the situation with a hint of helplessness marring his brow. After a split moment, he bowed respectfully. Lady Anya, Elder Isoltine, he greeted Anya and the older woman, giving the other elders a cursory greeting as well. My apologies, there's been a mistake at the border. Lionel Morales, correct? Since this mistake is on me and my department, how about I extend you a green VIP card? You'll be able to enter and exit guild territory for a year without fees or due process. ITLL, just take a day to finish the procedures, and then you can go about your business. Will that be okay? Lionel's pleading expression had already vanished toward one of neutrality. He already realized that there wasn't much of a point in keeping the act up. The moment this Ingnerl appeared, the situation was already far out of his control. Unless he was willing to completely fall out with the Force Crafting Guild and battle it out right here, this was as far as he would go. Plus, how would that end anyway? In order to get anything out of it, he would probably have to just plunder the treasure stores of the guild. If he really did that, he'd just gain himself another powerful enemy. From what Lionel understood, this Force Crafting Guild was just a small branch, but it represented the prestige of the main branch as well. No one would be let off after just randomly plundering an entire guild, unless he could hide his identity. But it was already too late for that. He didn't have enough skill to fool all those scanners and sensors just yet, nor did he have the time to invest in creating the force crafts or arts that could. This was why he didn't even bother to try for a disguise this time. However, if he kept running into trouble like this, it might be a worthwhile investment. All this said, this so-called green VIP Ignaral spoke of might be a worthy trade-off. If he ever got his hands on it, that is. It was clear that by Ignaral saying it would take a day, that they still wanted Lionel to get out of their sights as quickly as possible. And it didn't take a genius to understand that all of this was for Anya. Seeing the sudden indifference on Lionel's face, Ignaral's gaze narrowed. He knew well how Lionel had managed to slip through the cracks. The immigration practices across the universe was actually not much different from what you might find on Earth. Visas, citizenship, green cards, workers' permits. Even if they might not always go by the same name, the concepts are the same. For more stringent worlds like this one, even for a vacation, you had to meet certain standards comparable to what most worlds would ask to become a citizen. In that case, the algorithm had a test for youth and talent, obviously preferring people of a certain caliber to enter these walls. Lionel's talent was so great that even under the modified algorithm, he still managed to get through the screening, which led to this situation. Ultimately, everyone else thought that Lionel was a country bumpkin stirring up trouble. But Ignaral knew well that things weren't so simple. In fact, if it wasn't because of Anya, he might be forced to fawn over Lionel instead. Still, he had no choice but to pick his battles. At that moment, though, he felt as though Lionel was seeing right through him, unfazed by his word games and his attempts at pleasing both parties. In truth, Lionel was infuriated. He valued respect above most things, and right now he felt like his time was being wasted, because these people thought it was better to anger him en route to pleasing Lady Anya. This so-called green VIP card he would be given, regardless of how rare or nice it was, practically felt like a pat on the head he would receive for being a good boy. He had followed all the rules, done everything he needed to do, and even up until this point he had yet to lash out at anyone, but it simply didn't matter. Even in a situation where you did everything perfectly and as they should be done, if those with power wanted to find fault with you, they would find it. So, while Lionel stared at Ignaral emotionlessly, about to begrudgingly accept his proposal since he had no real choice in the matter, he had already remembered these matters in his heart. Excuse me?" Before Lionel could speak, that sweet voice rang out again. As though moths to a flame, all the elders and Ignaral turned over. All they were missing were tails to wag. Anya blinked her large golden eyes. Though it was hard to tell with her veil on, she looked to be at most around 17 years old. Though, she had the voice of a mature woman. "Did I come at the wrong time? If we can't take our exams today, I can just come back another time." The expressions of the elders changed. How were they supposed to respond to this? Were they supposed to say that they were barring others from taking their exams just so that she could do so alone? But saying such a thing so bluntly would cause problems. Plus, no one had known she was here to take an exam even if they had some guesses. Until right this very moment. Now it was almost impossible to hide it. Luckily, Ignaral was quick on his feet. No. It isn't that, Lady Anya. The problem is that our small branch is most suited to give black grade exams. Even all the elders here had to travel to larger branches to receive their bronze certifications. So in order to prepare and be certified for you bronze grade exams, we had to set up a lot of things. As of right now, we couldn't hand out a black grade exam even if we wanted to. That is why we're turning so many people away. The elders quickly nodded, feeling that Ignaral was truly quick on his feet to think of such an excuse. Plus, it wasn't entirely incorrect either. It had some kernels of truth to it. But it was then that Lionel's lip curled. "Who said I wasn't here to take a bronze grade exam? Did you even ask?" Chapter 928. Chapter 928. Targeting Ignaral was stunned. He had thought his plan to be foolproof, but now he could only try his best to hold back an ugly expression. According to the files, Lionel was Tier 1. In addition, the scan hadn't caught the sign of any other life forms on him, so it was most likely that he didn't have a spirit by his side, making it so that his force crafting would be limited. Of course, spirits were rare, so this wasn't exactly a negative on Lionel. It was just an observation, one that was just as important as the first. As someone who was in Tier 1, it was impossible for Lionel to have had the soul force needed to craft bronze treasures for long. In addition, considering Lionel's age, Ignero would guess that Lionel had been in the 5th dimension for a month or two at best. Any longer, and considering his talent, he would have progressed far more than he had. This was all to say that if Ignero had to assign a probability, he would guess with 97% assuredness that Lionel was not a bronze crafter, and was, at best, a quasi-bronze crafter, a feat that was still very much excellent for his age. In fact, Ignero thought that he had vastly overestimated Lionel as well. But hearing this, he felt like he was at a loss for words. The elders looked over toward Lionel, as though they wanted to tear him to shreds, especially Isoltine. It was clear that none of them believed Lionel. They weren't aware of what Lady Anya's backing was exactly, but they knew of the person who requested for them to take care of her. Such a person wasn't an individual they could afford to offend, and yet even they were subservient to Anya. This was enough to tell them just what a fearsome existence Lady Anya must be. And yet, this little troublemaker was trying to ruin everything. Unfortunately, before they could say anything, Anya's expression lit up. She clapped her hands together, her slender fingers and delicate palms turning red at just the slight strain. That's excellent. Then we can take the exams together. Anya seemed to be excited. Her smile bloomed beneath her veil. But it was just a shame that they could only catch the faintest shadow of it all. At that moment, the elders knew the situation was helpless. They didn't even get the chance to twist Lionel's arm into admitting that he was lying. It was all very infuriating. However, the troublemaker himself no longer spared them a glance, smiling in thanks to Anya. Lionel had never blamed Anya to begin with. After all, it was clear that this had all been done without her knowledge. At the same time, he also had a feeling that she wasn't as naive as she was pretending to be. Clearly, she was helping him. For this he was grateful. A beauty who also had a kind heart. Worthy of praise indeed. Ignero and the elders looked at each other, not quite knowing what to do. But Anya pushed them along with her next words. Little White is getting tired after pulling my carriage along all day. She would like to graze and relax a bit. I hope that we can start the exam sooner rather than later, so she can have some rest. Yes. Isoltine reacted. Please this way. Anya didn't bother to enter her carriage once again, walking beside Little White with a light smile on her face. Thank you. Lionel's voice was neither too loud nor too soft, so the elders leading the way forward, including Ignero, definitely heard him aim these words toward Anya. And yet, they could only pretend like they hadn't heard a thing. Anya looked over toward Lionel with sparkling eyes, her gaze carrying a hint of mischief, another hint of intelligence, and a splash of curiosity and kindness as she examined Lionel's face. I'm Anya. Lionel chuckled. I'm Lionel. Just Lionel? Anya blinked. Just Anya? Lionel replied. All right, Lady Anya. Anya said triumphantly. Lionel was speechless for a moment before he burst out into a fit of laughter. What was truly adorable was that Little White followed along with Lionel's lead, letting out successive jijiji sounds. Anya felt betrayed. Little White seemed to like Lionel even more than her. Across galaxies, Aina walked through a mansion under the escort of a maid, a cold expression hidden beneath her black mask. Here, Miss Brazinger. Aina nodded and entered the room. However, she was a bit surprised to find that there wasn't anything but an empty desk and chair. Of course, there were other office-like decorations like bookcases and the like. But other than that, the person she was sent here to meet was nowhere to be seen. Sorry for not being able to meet you face to face, Miss Brazinger. However, we're in a bit of a sensitive time at the moment. I had no choice but to bring you forward like this. Aina understood, and didn't say much as the sudden voice pervaded the room. It was impossible to tell where it came from, and even more impossible to pinpoint where the force art sustaining it was. So there was no point in bothering. Oh, get right to the point. I have a mission for you. Aina was prepared for as much. She had accepted Richard's proposal to join his faction for a few simple reasons. For one, she didn't particularly care what sort of position it put her father in. This wasn't to say that she didn't care about her father, but rather that they weren't a family that harped over minor details. Political strife wasn't something they took seriously. Secondly, Richard's proposal provided her the most training resources. It was as simple as that. Nothing more, nothing less. However, she was also aware that there was nothing free in this world. But she didn't mind. These missions would just be more opportunity to train and hone her skills. Your target is the Luxnix family. Chapter 929. Chapter 929. Show me. Lionel and Anya were escorted into a large room. There was just a single workbench present at the very center of it all, and 5 chairs prepared for the elders that would be, presumably, overseeing it all. Clearly, they had only prepared a single workbench believing that Anya would be the only one taking her exams, but Lionel had thrown a wrench into those plans. To make matters worse, Lionel and Anya seemed to be laughing and joking amongst each other, as though they were 2 old friends. It was difficult for the elders to even interject with any snide remarks without simultaneously offending Anya herself, who was clearly enthusiastically responding to everything Lionel said. So, they could only bite their tongues. In truth, they didn't care about whether 1 or 2 people took the exam now. Their issue with Lionel wasn't that he was here, but rather that he had made them lose face. Every happy interaction Lionel had with Anya was like another slap to their faces. It was as though they felt like he was snatching the good impression Anya was supposed to have of them for himself. Ignarel followed along with furrowed brows. He was meant to act as an ambassador for Anya, so he wasn't necessarily participating in this as a crafter. But that only made his emotions even more complicated than the other elders. In the end, there was Elder Isoltine who would have very much liked to lop Lionel's head off his neck. But she too could only stifle herself. I thought that you would be mean, but you're actually very nice. Anya said with a giggle. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Him? Mean? Since when did he give off that sort of impression? Mean? Your eyes always look like they're calculating something, like you have a barrier up for the world. Plus, there's something dangerous coming off from your body that you seem to be suppressing. You should smile more, yours is not bad to look at. Anya seemed to be commenting offhand, not thinking very much about what she was saying as her soothing voice tickled their eardrums. But Lionel felt his heart skip a beat. Was he like that? He had always thought himself to be quite charismatic. He had even managed to turn a school of nobles into one with a student body that actually respected a commoner like him. Lionel would often think of those times as he hopped from organization to organization, baffled as to why he couldn't have the same positive effect on them he had had on Royal Blue Academy. Why was it that he made enemies everywhere he went, and yet he was probably the most popular guy in his school? The dichotomy was something he had always blamed on the dimensional verse. It was a place that could even ignore his own charisma because it was more intent on fighting and killing than forging relationships and building a kind heart. But was that true? What if he was just receiving the energy he was putting out? Lionel didn't think the answer was so simple. There definitely were cruel factors in the dimensional verse he couldn't control. But did that mean he had to close himself off completely? Lionel's pale violet eyes seemed to glow lightly. His emotional intelligence and charisma were among the most useful traits he had, but it seemed that he had been handicapping himself. He rarely led with his charisma anymore. He was more apt these days to lead with indifference and only open up to a smile if someone responded the way he wanted them to. But that built up a flaw in his character. He had been so on guard against the dimensional verse that he was changing even himself to fit the parts he hated so much about it. What an irony! Lionel couldn't help but gaze at Anya quite deeply. This woman had only known him for about 10 minutes. Was it a coincidence she had said something so profound? Or was it deeper than that? There you go, calculating again. Anya said with a pout. Lionel didn't seem to mind this and smiled instead. You're quite smart for a little girl. Hey, who's a little girl? I'm already a woman, I'll have you know. I'm 20 years old. Anya stuck her ample chest out as though to prove a point, but all she got from Lionel was more laughter, causing her pout to only grow more pronounced. Thank you. Lionel suddenly spoke seriously. That's already twice today. I guess I owe you 2 favors now. Anya smiled knowingly, but didn't say much of anything else. At that moment, Elder Isoltine cleared her throat, taking the central position of the 5 chairs. The room was exceptionally hollow, making their voices echo. It was obvious that this room was usually able to test thousands of amateur crafters at a time. But now, it would only test 2. Apologies, we only prepared a single bronze workbench. No problem, Granny. I don't really need a workbench. Elder Isoltine's jaw clenched so hard it twitched. Who was your granny? She cleared her throat, trying to bury her rage. We didn't prepare the theory section of the crafter's exam, because we have reason to believe that Anya has already met the standard. But it is uncertain that. Elder Isoltine looked up toward Lionel, clearly wanting his name for the record. Usually, Lionel would just hand over his documents. But obviously this was impossible now. Unless he got a whole bunch of tape first. Lionel. He finished. Elder Isoltine all but rolled her eyes. We need your full name for the records. Right, Lionel chuckled, forgetting that he was no longer playing a game with Anya. Lionel Morales. Ah. Anya's eyes widened. She lifted her skirt, hopping to stand before Lionel and looking him up and down. She looked like a little girl who had found a new toy. The elders had no idea how to react to her antics. Do you have one? Show me. Show me. Lionel's lip twitched. Couldn't this girl choose her words more carefully? Chapter 930. Chapter 930 Certification. What are you talking about? Lionel chuckled and shook his head. Though he could make a few guesses, he still didn't jump to any conclusions. Who knew what this girl was asking to see? In truth, Lionel knew that he was a bit too casual with his treasures. He didn't put enough effort into hiding them. A portion of the reason why was because he didn't have a good frame of what was rare and what wasn't, but another was definitely that he was just a bit careless. The more powerful Lionel became, the more he felt that the people of this quadrant were actually quite weak. He felt like the difference between him and them wasn't very far apart even while he was in the 3rd dimension, let alone now that he was in the 5th. Even Elder Isoltine, who had experienced 2 watersheds of the 5th dimension, wasn't able to make him feel any pressure. However, Lionel's experiences in the dimensional cleanse trial world showed him that it wasn't that the world was weak, but rather that his scope of the world was too small. Even while so heavily suppressed and with himself having every advantage, he had still lost so miserably to Amory. If it was just this, things might have been fine. After all, Amory was in the 6th dimension while he hadn't even truly stepped into Tier 1 of the 5th dimension. However, Lionel felt that if it wasn't for the suppression of the trial, he wouldn't have stood a chance against Kira while he had been at the peak of the 4th dimension. Even beyond that, he didn't believe that defeating even the likes of Richard and that other man would have been a simple matter either. If there was anything that trial taught Lionel, it was that he shouldn't underestimate this world. There would be nothing simple about achieving his goals. This was all to say that he felt that if he was going to really do this, he had to learn to be a bit more cautious about some things. So he didn't immediately guess at what it was Anya wanted to see. Don't be like that, Anya said with an almost pleading tone. You know, just because you heard my last name, are you really sure of my origins? Can't there be other people with the Morales name that aren't from where you think I'm from? Anya pouted. Isn't the fact you said that enough to prove that I am right? Then again, only ignorant people say stuff like that. Maybe you really aren't from them. Lionel's lip twitched. He was finding it harder and harder to get a read on this girl. Was she mischievous? Introspective? Empathic? Or was it just that she enjoyed pointing out his flaws so much? Seeing that Lionel wasn't reacting as fast as she wanted him to, Anya shook her head and turned toward the elders. I can vouch for Lionel. His skill in theory is maybe better than mine. I don't come from a family of crafters, but his family is one that can ignore even the main branch of the Force Crafting Guild and not suffer from it. In fact, the main branch was only created so that other families would have a way of countering them. Good enough? Okay. Let's move on to the application part. Hearing these words, the elders froze, looking toward Lionel with incredulous expressions. By now, though, Lionel was certain that what Anya wanted to see was little Tolly. If not for this, she wouldn't be so eager to move on to the application portion of the exam. As for the reaction of the elders, he didn't particularly care. Lionel knew that he didn't have much relation to the Morales family. For all he knew, they were quite hostile to him. Of course, this wouldn't stop him from participating in their air wars. And it most definitely wouldn't stop him from allowing these elders to misunderstand. This was an opportunity to save himself some trouble, so why wouldn't he take advantage? Elder Isoltine wasn't sure how to accept this information. On the one hand, she didn't want to believe it. But on the other, she couldn't refute this young girl either. Even if she reached out and said that she wanted half the resources of their branch, Isoltine would just have to accept it. Ingnerl stood a distance away with his face also having frozen. But there was nothing he could do either. Then, Isoltine cleared her throat. We will begin with the spirit control portion of the exam. A strong pressure descended after Isoltine clapped her hands. However, Lionel felt that his body was perfectly fine. If there was any change at all, it was a slight sluggishness in his soul force. That was when he understood. This pressure was supposed to make it more difficult for you to use your soul force freely. This sort of control was invaluable for a crafter. 2 sets of rings appeared before Lionel and Anya, stretching out a 10-meter distance from them. There were just a pair of rings before each of them, one within arm's reach, and the other exactly 10 meters away. However, somehow this 10-meter distance felt like infinity. Take control of your familiars to travel the distance between these rings. A minimum travel distance of 1 meter is necessary to pass. Please begin. One moment. Lionel suddenly called out. I have a question. Isoltine, who still couldn't stand the sight of Lionel's face, still had no choice but to accommodate him for now. At the very least, she had to until they could corroborate Anya's words. It was obvious that Anya had just met Lionel, so how could they take her words for fact? Especially when they didn't want to believe these words to begin with. Yes. Is it only possible to become a Tier 1 bronze crafter during this exam? What do I need to do to aim for a higher certification? Isoltine's expression darkened. We can certify up to the Tier 3 bronze grade. However, that requires a minimum of 3 meters crossed for this test. She truly felt like her time was being wasted. Lionel shook his head. Was there that much of a difference between Tier 1 and 3? If it wasn't for the fact he needed the resources of this place, he wouldn't even bother. All right. Lionel nodded. Flipping his palm over, a smooth ball of silver appeared, bobbing up and down above his hand. Anya's eyes lit up. However, when the elders saw it, their gazes lit up with something far different than an innocent curiosity. Chapter 931. Published at 7th of June, 2022, 12:30 and 33 seconds p.m. Chapter 931. Rumors. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 931. Rumors. Metal spirit. The heartbeats of Isoltine, the other elders and even Ingnerl in the distance all skipped at once. But, even then, it was especially so for Ingnerl. Ingnerl had assumed that Lionel couldn't be a very powerful crafter because the scanners didn't detect even a pseudo-spirit, let alone the complete one he was seeing now. So to him, the appearance of this metal spirit meant something far different than what it did to the others, and his heart couldn't stop trembling out of control. He has a spatial treasure that can store life. Ingnerl forced himself to calm down. For one, there was the matter of Lionel's background. If he had such a treasure, that only confirmed Anya's words as more than just nonsense a mischievous little girl was spewing to help someone they saw as a friend. In addition, it was also possible that this was Lionel's ability. The one thing their scanners didn't test for was ability index. If they did so, it would cause an uproar, so they had no choice but to make such a concession. Some forms of beast-taming ability indexes also evolved such that their users could have inner worlds to maintain and nurture their creatures. So he knew he shouldn't jump to conclusions. However, when that greed bloomed, it became difficult to suppress. Especially when the metal spirit before him was more valuable than even most spatial treasures of that caliber. Lionel ignored those around him, a bright smile blooming on his face. "Hey little guy, how was your spa day?" Asterisk bloop. Bloop. Lionel chuckled. Usually he would have little Tolly on his wrist. But after the segmented cube evolved, it gained the ability to nurture spirits as well. So he had been leaving little Tolly in there. In truth, Lionel felt a bit bad after neglecting little Tolly for so long. So he had been spending a lot of time communicating with the little guy. Especially during the dimensional cleanse trial where he didn't really have much to do anyway. So, the two were much closer now than they had been back when Lionel had left him for 2 years. Of course, it wasn't exactly Lionel's fault that had happened. But little Tolly was still in his infancy stages. You couldn't exactly tell a baby why it was logical that their parent had left them, right? The result was Lionel being especially doting toward little Tolliver now. So cute. Anya all but squealed as she watched little Tolly turn into all sorts of shapes and sizes. Lionel smiled but didn't say much of anything. "All right, little Tolly. Let's go." Asterisk bloop. Little Tolly shot out from floating above Lionel's palm like a speeding bullet. In one instant, it was before Lionel, and in the next, the little guy was hovering just past the 3-meter mark, dancing about with a childish flair. Sometimes little Tolly would take the shape of a star, sometimes something as random as a baseball bat, and other times it would even become creatures. The little guy's favorite creature to imitate was definitely Little Black Star, so it would often become an adorable little silver mink, its whiskers twitching about as though to mock its foe in his absence. Lionel didn't restrict little Tolly's freedom or adventurous side in the slightest. One would have thought that this would impede his control. But even as little Tolly flipped between whatever images came to its mind, the little one still hovered exactly at 3 meters without strain to either Lionel or itself. Pada OVL with just a casual beckoning of his finger, little Tolly came back, hopping up and down in the air as though asking for praise. The elders and Anya watched in astonishment as Lionel actually pet the little silver mink without a care for his hands. Anya would have screamed out to say something, but she too was a bit in shock that Lionel had passed the test so easily. They suddenly realized right then that Lionel wasn't bluffing. If not for the Tier 3 cap, how far could he go? Visit Readle. Me for extra chapters. As the tests blazed by one after another, even the likes of Elder Isoltine had to admit that they had provoked a monster. Asterisk. Back in the 3-pillar galaxy, planet Luxnix had entered an odd state as though a fog was beginning to hang over them. Odd rumors about matters from decades ago began to circulate. Even now, the matter was still quite slow and subtle, no one daring to offend the Luxnix family with too much brazenness. But every time it seemed that those rumors would be smothered, the fire seemed to be rekindled elsewhere. Though the Luxnix family was still unable to confirm it with absolute certainty, they were smart enough to begin guessing that someone was definitely targeting them. Rumors in and of themselves weren't a big deal. However, the larger the family, organization or guild, the more they would have to worry about such things. One only need to look toward the example of Camelot to understand why. When it came to the dimensional verse, even a false story when spread wide enough could come to life, let alone a story many thought was plausible or even probable. For the Luxnix family that placed such an emphasis on purity as a result of their lineage factor, such a story of impurity circulating around could even begin to subtly weaken the power of their bloodline. Such a thing was far more serious than it seemed, to the point where the Luxnix family would easily become irreconcilable with anyone who dared to spread such a thing. But what would they do if everyone felt it was true? At that moment, there was a group of young men indulging in the fine dining planet Luxnix had to offer. It was said that the unique air of this world allowed women to grow up to become more beautiful, so they were quite famed for their gorgeous waitresses and hostesses. This reason alone was enough for countless young men, even from other noble sixth-dimensional families, to flock toward this location, especially after finishing a hard mission. Among these group of young men, there was a particularly one by the name of Asen, the very target of the first of Richard's plans. He chugged his beer grandly, leering at the perky bottoms of a passing waitress before leaning forward toward his group of friends. "Have you all heard those rumors?" he whispered with flushed cheeks. Right then, a figure dressed in leather armor and wearing a black mask casually entered the same restaurant. Author's note: there will only be 2 chapters today. A headache has gotten the best of me. There will also, unfortunately, be no chapters tomorrow. I will be back the day following with 4 chapters. It's about time we get to the meat of this volume. Chapter 932. Published at 7th of June, 2022, 12:30 and 32 seconds p.m. Chapter 932. 10% faster if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 932. 10% faster. The moment the young men around Austin heard his words, their expressions twisted. Whenever this fool got a few shots of alcohol in him, he always forgot about everything else. They were quite literally in Luxnick's territory, all while having lunch in one of their more famous restaurants. This was the worst time to bring up a scandal like this. As young nobles of their families, they had been trained in etiquette and personal brand and safety since they were old enough to put their clothes on by themselves. Among those lessons was the care they needed to take when out in public, especially when there were so many flies with ears buzzing around. Who knew how many young masters had had their lives ruined by being overheard by a pretty waitress? The truth was that they weren't meant to be there to begin with. The moment such rumors started floating around, Austin's elder brother had strictly banned his young buffoon of a younger brother from coming to Planet Luxnick's to begin with. However, it was exactly this ban that made Austin want to come all the more. The current Austin was followed by 2 youths, one of which was from First City but wasn't an heir candidate. The second was also from the First City, but was the son of a vassal. Their names were Maul and Willith respectively. The moment the words fell, both Maul and Willowith's necks snapped in a particular direction. But what they saw allowed them to sigh a breath of relief. The waitress whose bottom Austin had just been leering at seemed too far away, and also hadn't reacted to the words. This set their hearts at ease. Maul waved a hand, causing a thin barrier of force to appear around their table that was nearly completely invisible to the eye. This was part of his ability, but it was slightly different in comparison to other energy shield abilities of the like. "Austin, please watch your words." Austin snorted. "I can't ask questions?" He took another chug of his beer, his cheeks already turning rosy. One would have thought that his alcohol tolerance would be far greater with how burly he was. But a secondary look would tell you that Austin was far less burly. Then he was just chubby. He was just quite lucky in the fact that his frame was quite large thanks to his lineage. But rather than filling it out with muscle, you could probably cut him open for a few pints of beer if you were so inclined. Maul and Willith sighed in relief, thinking that Austin was going to lay the topic to rest. But when he sat back up from swinging his head back, Austin's gaze seemed more fiery than ever. "You two don't remember?" "Probably not, actually. I don't really remember either. I've just heard my brother talk about her a few times. I've never seen Gradier take a liking to anything." "You guys know my older brother. He's a stone-faced statue. If it wasn't because I've seen him a few times in the bathhouse, I'd think he was stoned down there too. But when it came to that woman, his eyes always used to light up like 2 gems. You could say that he's an outright simp, a simp of epic proportions, a simp to end all simps. He's actually pining over a woman that apparently let a country bumpkin put a baby in her. Haha. I can't stop laughing." Maul and Willith looked toward one another with pale expressions. Only Austin would dare to say something like this about Gradier. But luckily, they had the barrier up and Austin's words were still vague enough that even if it wasn't, people wouldn't necessarily tie the 2 events together. Whenever Austin got like this, they didn't quite dare to stop him, not out of fear of Austin himself, but rather his elder brother. At the same time, though, they didn't dare to join in either. What a joke, they still wanted their lives. And Gradier always seemed to have a method of finding out things other people didn't want him to figure out. Visit Riedel. Me for extra chapters. So they remained silent. Haha. That big brother of mine has always been so perfect, and yet he made such a mistake. I really can't stop laughing. It's too funny. Austin hiccuped, his awkward breath getting caught somewhere between a gasp, a heave and a burp. It was like the mouth equivalent of not trusting a fart. Only Austin could accomplish such a great feat, admirable indeed. In the end, what came out was a bubble of spit before Austin fell over in his chair. He hadn't even reached the ground before he was suddenly snoring so loudly that Maul and Willith almost felt the need to cover their ears. Maul shook his head. Waving his hand again, he dispelled the barrier and called a waitress over. He then used a connected service to book a room in a nearby inn the owner of this restaurant had a stake in. He had flown in a shuttle with a drunk, bloated and burping Austin before. He refused to do it again. One such event was enough trauma for a lifetime. Plus, there was still some business to handle. Hours later, the sun set and planet Luxnix fell into darkness. With how the three planets rotated around one another, there was always at least one that was experiencing a bright day. This coupled with how frequent and easy travel between them was, there was no such thing as closing time for most establishments. However, this didn't mean that workers didn't have off shifts. It was right then that a particular young lady with a perky bottom accentuated by her tight, short skirt, waved her goodbyes to her colleagues and boss. She drifted out of the restaurant, a peculiar light in her eyes glowing bright after being hidden all day. Her steps were about 10% quicker than they usually were, and her breathing was also slightly shallower than normal. It was like she had an excitement within that could hardly be contained. And yet, all of that deflated the instant she chose to take a shortcut through an alleyway. An alarming feeling of danger gripped her as two figures blocked her path forward and back. Chapter 933. Published at 7th of June, 2022, 12:30 and 31 seconds p.m. Chapter 933. Young waitress. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 933. Young waitress. The waitress froze, her small frame trembling. She suddenly felt as though it was particularly cold despite the fact planet Luxnix had spring-like temperatures year-round. There was no surprise that the two figures that had blocked her path were Maul and Willith. Likewise, it was also no surprise that this young woman was the very same waitress with a perky, but that Austin had been ogling at. Maul and Willith were too experienced with cleaning up Austin's messes to take a chance like this. At the same time, these waitresses knew well the kind of job they had. Not a single waitress picked out for such a high-end restaurant wouldn't be extremely beautiful, extremely skilled, and most importantly of all, extremely intelligent. A waitress might be a position many stereotypically look down upon, but the higher in the restaurant, the more stringent the requirements. At a certain level, becoming a waitress was not only exceptionally lucrative, but highly revered as well. Due to knowing such things, Maul and Willith had even come together, cutting off all paths of retreat, and not taking a single chance. Even when this young woman began to shiver in fear, they didn't lower their guards in the slightest. It was possible that she really was so weak, but it was equally as possible that she was a talent that surpassed the two of them. In that moment, without even waiting for any words to be exchanged, the two shot forward, killing intent thick in their gazes. Maul had already set up a barrier to block out all sounds. This one was even thicker than the one he laid in the restaurant. A vast energy coated Maul's palm as he struck toward her chest. A spark of lightning ran through Willith's irises as he too struck out, but toward her back. It was right then that the seemingly frail young lady sprung to life. She slipped out of her high-heeled shoes in one smooth motion, and tore a line up the thigh of her pencil skirt, uncaring for the skin or undergarments she exposed in the process. What was her dignity if she couldn't keep her life? She knew exactly what was happening here. It seemed that her act in pretending not to hear a thing earlier hadn't worked. Or rather, maybe it had worked, but they still chose to cut away loose ends and not leave anything up to chance. It seemed that after a few years of working in the industry, she finally ran into her first life and death situation. But all hope wasn't lost. They were in the middle of the city. As long as she could find a chance to break through those barriers, the guards would be alerted, and she would have a good chance to live. If this was Viola family territory, it would be helpless. But luckily this wasn't their arena to control. The young woman's body became as nimble as a panther's, her body taking a quarter spin to the side, and arching out of the way of the two strikes. Maul and Willith's palms smashed against one another, missing their target. The resulting impact sent the woman flying toward a wall of the alleyway, something she took full advantage of. Her toenails seemed to grow into 2-inch claws, tearing through her black stockings and cutting into the wall to anchor her propulsion upward. Before Maul and Willith could react, she was already more than 10 meters in the air, her arm cocking back as her fingers also grew with claws, each one having their own metallic sheen beneath the twinkling golden moonlight. The young waitress' back was bloody from the impact of Maul and Willith's strike, her once tight shirt having been ravaged by violent force and her trickling blood. She could feel her vision swimming as she forcefully kept it together. Just the aftershocks of their strikes put her in such a state. Yet even without looking back, she could tell that both of them weren't injured even after exchanging blows like that. The difference between them was clear and obvious, at least in terms of defenses. This was her one chance. She had to break through this barrier. Visit Readle.me for extra chapters. The young woman's eyes lit up with excitement. She had made it. Her claw ripped forward, coated by a menacingly sharp force. It tore through the energy barrier Maul had set up like a knife through butter. The young waitress' chest expanded as she took a deep breath. "Help! Someone is trying to kill me!" she roared out at the top of her lungs. She put so much effort into tearing through the barrier that she lost sight of the building before her. In the back of her mind, she felt that tearing through that energy wall had been too easy. She had put so much effort in the swing that it knocked her off balance, causing her to lose a chance at staying latched onto the tall walls. The young waitress found her falling back to the ground, her expression changing. She realized in that moment that she still couldn't hear the bustle of the city even after tearing through the barrier. There's more than one barrier. She realized in that moment that she had made a mistake. It wasn't that Maul and Willith couldn't chase after her, but rather that they didn't have to. In all likelihood, they were confident that even if she realized this earlier on, she would have been blocked and sent tumbling down by the second barrier. Who would have known that she would ruin herself before she could even make it that far? Despair sunk its hooks into the young woman's heart. She too had her own story, who didn't? She thought that this would be her chance to take a step forward. But it seemed that she would be like so many who got snuffed out by the harsh realities of the world long before they got a chance. Maul and Willith's gazes locked onto her as she fell to the ground, hopeless to do anything. They brandished their palms again, ready to kill her in one blow. Until they sensed a killing intent sharper than even their own. Before the two men could react, a shadow had appeared between them, catching the young waitress who had accepted her fate out of the air. The masked shadow swept an indifferent gaze toward the two of them. Chapter 934. Published at 7th of June, 2022, 12:30 and 30 seconds p.m. Chapter 934. 8 of 12 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 934. 8 of 12 Maul and Willith felt a deep sense of fear for some reason. They didn't even register that this shadow was a woman until they breathed their last breaths. Maybe it was only then, when they could finally release their worries, that they could notice something so meaningless. The battle lasted less than 100 exchanges, and there were even some points they believed they might be able to win. But the rate of improvement the masked shadow underwent was far beyond their expectations, or anything they could handle. No, it wasn't improvement. It was as though the shadow was adapting their already ridiculously strong combat capabilities to counter the two of them specifically. It was the most shocking feat of battle they had ever seen. Even in death, they couldn't help but admire it. The sound of two bodies falling to the ground resonated as the masked shadow finally put the young woman down. "Thank you. Thank you." The young woman bowed deeply. Even though her back had been torn open and was still bleeding, she still took the effort to properly bow. The masked shadow, who was obviously none other than Aina, nodded lightly. In her hand, she brandished a spear, much different from her usual battle axe. But it was hard to tell that if this was another training method to help her break through, or if she was just trying to hide her identity. If Maul and Willith had known that they died to someone not even using the weapon they were most comfortable with, who knew how they would react? Seeing that gratitude of the young woman, Aina nodded lightly before vanishing. Her mission had already been complete. In truth, she was supposed to follow Asen around until he slipped up and could be pinned with the crime of spreading false rumors by the Luxnix family. But this was just the third day and he had already failed so epically. Richard knew that Asen had his elder brother's followers cleaning up after him, so he had sent Aina here to interfere with their cleanup duties. The fact that Maul had put up such a convenient barrier only helped her out. The battle had been more difficult than she thought it would be though. The two might have been from the first city, however they were under the umbrella of their families. Only when you became junior general would you be assigned to a city based on your own strength. This was to say that a junior general from City 6 like Samson was far stronger than a youth without a title from the first city. But it was clear that Maul and Willith had been refraining from applying to become junior generals, so that they could continue to protect and clean up after Asen. If they applied now, Aina guessed that they would either be elites in City 6 or even mainstays of City 5. They weren't simple characters indeed. But that also meant that since Asen's elder brother, Greater dared to send them here without worrying for their dissatisfaction, his true subordinates were far more powerful than this. It seemed that the competition of heirs was ramping up as they slowly reached maturity. The closer they got to the sixth dimension, the closer the elders of the past generations would be toward having to make a final decision. And now, Richard had thrown down the gauntlet. The young woman watched as Aina vanished, the sounds of the city entering her ears once more. She looked toward the dead bodies and panicked slightly before regaining her bearings. One part of her wanted to go home and forget that any of this had ever happened, but she was much smarter than this. She knew that the fact Aina had come here to save her was not a coincidence. This was definitely planned. Now even if she wanted to, there was no way out of this. If she really went home, she bet it wouldn't be long before Aina appeared before her again. And if that happened, reward she could have monopolized for herself would probably end up in someone else's hands. Gritting her teeth, the young woman made her resolve. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. It was exactly like this that a small character set rolling the events that would embroil 3 planets into chaos. Asen snored away like some sort of big baby. The bed he rolled about on was easily enough to fit half a dozen people comfortably, and yet he somehow managed to go from edge to edge without much effort. The smell in the room was absolutely foul despite how high-end and luxurious the accommodations were. Unfortunately, no amount candles and incense sticks could match the fog of alcohol, vomit and shit-stain-inducing farts. However, it was exactly then that Asen's dreams came to an abrupt end. Bang! The heavy oak doors of the hotel room flew off their hinges, shards of splintered wood sprinkling through the air and falling to the ground. Asen, no matter how much of a deep sleeper he was instantly awoken. Fear, shock and confusion colored his features. It was clear that he had no idea what was going on. He had just been in a land of dreams when he suddenly heard a lot of banging, shouting and roaring. If it was just a battle, that would be fine. But it felt like all this noise was being aimed at him. Why? What had he done? What the hell? At that moment, a middle-aged man wearing tight, white leather armor walked in. He had a 12-pointed star radiating a delicate light on the left of his chest and 2 beautifully embroidered feathers on both of his tall collars. To his waist, an exceptionally thin sword could be found. So thin, in fact, that one might not even be able to tell that they had been stabbed until it was far too late. Asen's expression changed, and the fog of his mind finally vanished when he saw this middle-aged man. It was as though a bucket of cold water had been poured over his head as he was stunned awake. This uniform could only be worn by the most elite guard of the Luxnix family. While the Viola family had vassals, the Luxnix family had Feather Star warriors, and this man actually had 8 of his 12 star points illuminated. Asen didn't know what he had done, but he knew that it was serious now. Chapter 935. Published at 7th of June, 2022, 12:30 and 29 seconds p.m. Chapter 935. Try if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 935. Try bind him. The middle-aged man said coldly. Asen's expression changed. What is the meaning of this? I am a seed of the Viola family's main bloodline. You can't do this to me. The middle-aged man hardly reacted to this realization. It was clear that he was perfectly aware of Austin's identity, as the young waitress had reported this. This was part of the reason why they had sent someone of his stature to deal with such a thing to begin with. The Feather Star Warriors of the Luxnix family were not a joke. They were an elite guard that rarely, if ever, saw the light of day. They were split into 4 tiers. Starless, 4-point, 8-point, and 12-point. Of course, this ranking system was based on the most famous symbol of the Luxnix family, the 12-pointed star. Not many knew or understood the secrets behind this symbol, or how it related to the snowy star owl, or if it was related at all. But what they did know was that the Luxnix family would be willing to go to war to protect its prestige. To be a 12-point Feather Star Guard was the absolute highest honor, and such trump cards rarely left the family grounds. But this could even be said for the Starless Guards as well. The fact that an 8-point Feather Star Guard was actually sent here was enough to show just how serious this matter was, and how furious the Luxnix family was about these circulating rumors. Austin wasn't able to resist as he found his wrists and ankles chained. His combat prowess wasn't very high to begin with, so how could he be a match for such elite warriors? The entire city fell into silence as Austin was dragged away. The number of eyewitnesses were so numerous that it was impossible to hide. And maybe the Luxnix family didn't want to hide it. At the same time, though, those that had a guess as to what was happening didn't dare to say a word. There was a saying on 21st century Earth that said what appeared on the internet would always be there. It was just a way of letting everyone know that there were some things that couldn't be taken back, and it wasn't so easy to erase the truth. However, were things still so simple when the technology in question was far beyond that time? What if the government had absolute control? What if there was a powerful existence that could decide your life and death on a whim? Maybe in those cases, it wouldn't necessarily be impossible to shape and change the truth. Unfortunately, the Luxnix family wasn't on its own. There were 2 other families with its level of strength in this region, and one of them was already targeting them. This was just the beginning of a brewing storm, and the one who started it all, Richard, was nowhere near the destruction. Across the dimensional verse, back in a galaxy far weaker, on the surface, that is, a group of elders sat in abject shock, unable to gather themselves. It felt like every test they gave Lionel, he passed with just enough to reach a Tier 3 standard. And yet, it was done with such ease that it couldn't have been more obvious to them that his skill was beyond just this. Visit Rietal. Me for extra chapters. Even though Anya was also shocking in her own right, completing the Tier 1 trials with a steady and sweet smile on her face, they had already expected as much from her. But this Lionel came out of nowhere, and even seemed to have more skill than many of them. The truth was that Lionel was only truly being held back by his designation. Due to his weak dimension in the past, his finger speed, dexterity and strength couldn't keep up with the rest of him. The only reason he had even been able to forge bronze treasures back then was thanks to his metal body. Unfortunately, though it gave him strength, it didn't give him the corresponding dexterity and flexibility now, though those shackles had been shattered. Lionel's hand speed was at a superior grade 1 designation for the bronze grade, granting him perfection. Lionel also felt that if he used star fusion, he could even push past this to a silver grade designation. In the end, there was no fault Elder Iseltine could find. Somehow, their small branch had gained another Tier 3 bronze crafter, leaving them at a loss for words. Even their best crafter, an older man who was currently not present, was only Tier 4. Right behind him was Iseltine, but she was only Tier 3. Just like Lionel. They truly didn't know how to wrap their heads around this. One had to know that in the guild, status wasn't based on seniority or family power. It was all based on skill. In the blink of an eye, Lionel suddenly had the same level of authority they all did, and also had the same amount of say. He had gone from someone who could be blocked at a gate to an existence that could directly kill a guard for even daring to think of doing such a thing. Done? Lionel asked. His expression didn't look like he had done anything particularly impressive. In fact, he looked quite calm and relaxed. In truth, as he had been undergoing these tests, he had been thinking more about what Anya had said to him as opposed to anything else. He felt that she was definitely correct, no matter what her motives were. He couldn't enter every situation bracing for hostility, then be shocked when that was exactly the energy he received. And, even when he still received hostility in return, who knew if he was just meeting someone who was as jaded as he had once been? In that case, shouldn't he also give them a chance to change their tune like he would? He needed friends and allies right now, not enemies. He was well aware that he couldn't do all of this alone. If his attempts still failed in the end, at least he would know that he tried. So Lionel smiled. Miss Iseltine, I noticed that pendant around your neck has a bit of damage on it. How about you let me take a look free of charge? Take it as a gift to a fellow crafter. Lionel smiled warmly. Iseltine suddenly found her old heart skipping a beat. Chapter 936. Published at 7th of June, 2022, 12:30 and 28 seconds p.m. Chapter 936. Not a big deal if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 936. Not a big deal. Iseltine snapped out of her surprise, subconsciously shaking her head. She had been so annoyed with Lionel all this time that she hadn't noticed until just now that this boy was quite handsome. Wait, what was she thinking? She was old enough to be his grandmother's grandmother. She had grown out of the swooning over pretty men stage a long time ago. Though there were still some faint lines of beauty on her aged features, definitely above average for a woman as lived as her, she wasn't under the illusion that she could still attract men with her looks. At least not men who weren't at least as old as she was, that is. But even those old bastards would prefer to chase after youthful swan meat. It was quite the double-edged sword. As a crafter, Iseltine's thinking speed might not match up to Lionel's, but it was still far greater than most. This was usually a good thing, but at the moment she felt like she had overthought something as benign as a smile. It was embarrassing to the point her cheeks flushed slightly. Of course, this flushing had little to do with her attraction to Lionel, and everything to do with the embarrassing train of her thoughts. After all, as she had told herself previously, she had long since grown out of such a stage. However, before she could regain her bearings, she found that Lionel was before her, his hand having already reached out to lightly grasp the pendant that had hung from her neck. In that moment, she found herself frozen again. This time it was because of two things. For one, Lionel's scent was unique. It wasn't masked by cologne and felt fresh and natural, and yet it still held an edge of intoxication to it. The best thing it could be likened to, for lack of a better comparison, was fresh paper. When one entered an office, especially one that had large printers blasting at full tilt all hours of the day, the first few whiffs of that new paper smell was almost drug-like. Iseltine felt that Lionel's scent was like this, but it was far more layered, complex and fragrant. But at the same time, it wasn't as overpowering nor was it as easy to get over as the smell of paper. The second that shocked Iseltine, though, was that Lionel actually dared to get so close to her without warning. Maybe if she still had that same hate for Lionel, she would have slapped him to death for doing such a thing. Or, maybe if he wasn't so nice to look at or smell, she would have reacted in that way even if she had a good impression of him. But for some reason, she just froze, her gaze locked onto Lionel's fingers as they twirled her jade pendant between them. Compared to Lionel's face or his scent, Iseltine found Lionel's hands to be the most enticing. She couldn't take her eyes off of them. They were slender and well-kempt, but they also coursed with veins that traveled up his forearm. Their beauty was beyond anything she had ever seen, and the longer she looked at them, the more she felt her chest being taken over by a searing heat. By the time Iseltine realized that there was something wrong with her actions, a flash of silver covered Lionel's hands for a moment before retreating. Lionel lowered the elder's pendant back down, careful not to touch the skin of her chest before taking a step back. Iseltine's was going to speak before her pendant began to glow lightly. At that moment, a gentle green energy wafted out from it, pouring into her skin and coursing through her veins. In just a few circulations, Iseltine's cheeks seemed rosier, her skin less wrinkled, and she felt as if her energy reserves had been replenished 3 times over. Visit Readle Me for extra chapters. In just a few minutes, under their astonished gazes, her age regressed by at least 5 years. Though she still looked like she could be a grandmother, It was now to the point one might have to ask her just how young had she had her first child to still be so youthful. Isoltine was stunned. He actually repaired it. What Lionel didn't know was that Isoltine had won this pendant at an auction about 10 years ago. It was made of a very precious jade, known as revitalizing jade. Much like many other precious ores, revitalizing jade came in several grades, and this one just so happened to be of the bronze grade, allowing it to have great effects on helping a fifth-dimensional existence to retain their youth. As one might expect, it was extremely expensive. It took trading off decades, centuries even, of hard work for Isoltine to get her hands on it. And even then, she only managed to succeed thanks to the fact this was an incredibly small piece, and the fact it was sold damaged. If it was so easy to repair, Isoltine would have done it herself long ago, or the auction house would have taken those steps long before they decided to auction this piece off. And yet it took Lionel a brief moment? What kind of exaggerated nonsense was this? The jade around her neck now was easily worth 100 times what she paid for it. This amount of wealth dangling from her neck almost made her want to forgo youth and sell it off again. Was this really just a gift? No matter how stone-hearted Isoltine was, she couldn't muster up the same hatred she had before. In fact, what happened before couldn't even be considered hatred, it was more like annoyance. It was just that in her position, when someone or something annoyed her, the results would be devastating for them. Thank you. The words sounded so foreign rolling off her tongue that Isoltine flushed red again beside herself. This Lionel was truly the bane of her existence. Lionel just grinned. It's not a big deal. A metal spirit is especially good at forging small, intricate parts and is also excellent at repairing items. It was just a small task. Chapter 937. Published at 13th of June, 2022, for 04:56 AM. Chapter 937. Question: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 937. Question: Isoltine's mood and attitude seemed to shift on a dime. Quite frankly, rather than being shocked, her colleagues were more jealous than anything else. As crafters, they understood the value of her jade pendant quite well. But after Lionel also extended helping hands to them, their tunes couldn't help but change. Before Anya and Ignaro understood what was happening, the five of them were happily chatting about their crafts, completely forgetting that there was a certification exam going on. If not for Ignaro clearing his throat and excusing himself, who knew how long it would have gone on for? Ignaro walked out of the guild house shaking his head. He really didn't know what to make of this day. He had some crafting experience of his own, and he had never seen a youth as talented in this aspect. Even Anya, who had gained acknowledgement of that person, couldn't match up. Though it was clear that Anya was also holding back, Lionel did the same with far more elegance and ease. The gap between them was as clear as day. Still, Ignaro felt that much of this gap could be explained by their familiars. A metal spirit was just too perfect for crafters. Though it couldn't be used across disciplines like a flame spirit, for example, within its niche, it was untouchable. As for Anya, though she had a great background, she only had an ordinary flame spirit. Ignaro shook his head. There was nothing normal about having a flame spirit. His perspective had been twisted by Lionel to the point where he forgot that Anya's flame spirit was the first he had seen in his lifetime. Beyond that, even if Anya could get a metal spirit, not just anyone could control one. As far as Ignaro knew, they were incredibly dangerous, which was what made it even more shocking that Lionel didn't even use force crafting gloves. Just what kind of monster is he? Ignaro shook his head, putting his greed away. He didn't have a death wish. Even if he could defeat Lionel, what about his backers? The fact that everyone who came here had to be registered was a double-edged sword. He couldn't just erase information that Lionel had been here. And because of that, if something happened to Lionel, it wouldn't be long before he and the other elders became suspects. By then he would be finished. Plus, if Anya was correct about Lionel's origins, let alone him being implicated, his entire family and even the guild itself might be eradicated because of him. He had no intentions of getting embroiled in such nonsense. Ignaro shook his head for the third time in just as many minutes. At that moment, he suddenly got another message from his tablet. This time, though, the gears and force arts that ran across its surface shifted, forming the emblem of an organization Lionel recognized all too well. Shield Cross Stars. This wasn't a very surprising development, at least not for Igneril. The truth was that the security of worlds like this one were often left up to Shield Cross Stars. After all, they were the universe's police force. At the request of powers, they could take root at your borders and give a layer of protection you wouldn't otherwise have. The concept was similar to someone on Earth buying a security service and planting their emblem in their front yard for all to see. Sometimes, the fact that there was a certain level of security to begin with was more important than the security or its level itself. Roye, this was mostly a route taken on by guilds and merchant hubs, while organizations, kingdoms, families and empires usually handled their own security, though there would always be exceptions. Of course, this came with a fee, but for the Force Crafters Guild, it was negligible. Visit Riedel. Me for extra chapters. As for Igneril himself, he worked for Shield Cross Stars and could be considered to be a hired hand of the guild. As such, though he answered to the guild directly, those orders could be overruled by Shield Cross Stars in some circumstances. He had been tasked with Anya's safety by both the Force Crafting Guild and Shield Cross Stars. So the seriousness of this charge couldn't be underestimated, which was why he had been especially sensitive to Lionel's arrival. Even now, he hadn't forgotten his job. Hours ago, he had ordered a detailed background check for Lionel, but he had already expected not to find much of anything. If Anya was right about Lionel's identity, he didn't have the cachet to access information on those higher-order families and organizations. So he had fully expected to receive an access denied. But when he looked down to casually accept his fate, he froze instead. What? Why are you looking at me like that? Lionel smiled, looking toward Anya, who was observing him curiously behind her veil. She seemed to be trying to look into his mind. The two walked through the hallways of the guild house, heading toward the treasure house. Though they had yet to build up any merits, in all their gratitude, the elders and Isoltine had given 1,000,000 guild points to Lionel directly. Lionel had no idea if this was a lot or not, but he still accepted them enthusiastically. It seemed that being kind no matter the circumstances came with its own perks. Anya blinked. My mom said to avoid men who were too charismatic. Lionel's lip twitched. First he was too mean, but now he was too nice? Maybe he should have been used to the difficulty of pleasing women by now. He couldn't help but sigh as his mind wandered to Aina again. Oh right. Lionel suddenly thought of something he had meant to ask Anya before, but it felt inappropriate to do so. You said that only the ignorant would say what I said about family names. What did you mean by that? Is it not possible for others to be called Morales? Lionel felt that there was something off about that. Morales wasn't exactly a unique family name on Earth. Chapter 938. Published at 13th of June, 2022, 4:04 and 56 seconds AM. Chapter 938. Like you do if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 938. Like you do. Anya blinked, checking over Lionel to see if he was being serious. Before, she had thought that Lionel was just trying to be cheeky. After all, someone of his standing should be well aware of the reason. But she was confused to see that Lionel was actually serious. Was he really not from the Morales family? No, that didn't make sense. Metal spirits rarely submitted to anyone outside of members of that family, and little Tali seemed far too obedient. Plus, she could sense a strong Earth variant affinity coming from him. Anya shook her head, not minding it anymore. The higher level someone is, the more unlikely it is for them to share a name with such a powerful family. The fifth dimension is already too high for you to still be able to casually call yourself Morales without truly being from that family, especially since you're so young. Why though? Well, just the same as the future can influence that past, the inverse should obviously be true as well. In fact, though that much should be intuitive, it's even deeper than you think. It's more accurate to say that the past can change the future. Lionel's brows furrowed. He felt like he was back in school learning algebra for the first time. What kind of nonsense was this? It was both obvious and baffling at the same time. It was obvious that the past affected the future. But what did it mean for it to change it? After the past happened, wouldn't a set future decided by cause and effect already be set into motion? What did it mean to change it? If I had to explain it as simple as possible, if someone of your caliber appeared and shared the Morales family name, all while not being affiliated with them, it would mean that the destruction of the Morales family wouldn't be too far away. Well, it might not be so exaggerated, but the Morales family probably wouldn't allow it to happen. You'd probably have your own personal swarm of bodyguards coming after you. Lionel's expression became weird. How could any of this be considered an explanation? Actually, Anya tapped a finger to her veil-covered lips. If it was you specifically, it would definitely mean that the destruction wouldn't be far away. They'd probably even send a seventh-dimensional existence, a step away from the eighth dimension after you. Anya kept babbling on and on as though Lionel should already understand what she was saying, but he was only growing more confused. And why him specifically? Why me specifically? Anya blinked and turned her golden gaze toward Lionel. Something about her felt far more profound than it had before. An odd, almost ancient force swirling about her. Because you're dangerous. For a moment, it didn't even seem that Anya was the one who was speaking, but rather someone far more aged and mature. Compared to the mischievous girl that Lionel knew, she was completely different to the point they could only be comparable in looks and nothing else. Lionel didn't know how to respond to this in the slightest. What about him was dangerous, exactly? He couldn't help but think back to the words his coach had spoken about, and the backstory that connected him and Lionel. He still didn't know how those machines of Earth had concluded him to be a danger to society. However, Lionel believed he had come up with an explanation for this. Back then, Earth couldn't even properly categorize his ability, because it could only properly read 5% of his DNA, and was confused by the remaining 95%. Wasn't it obvious, then, that it could have misread him in this situation as well? This conclusion had helped Lionel to throw those matters to the back of his mind. He had always subconsciously ignored it, even to the point where despite always telling Aina everything, when it came to this he never did. Plus, hadn't he lived a perfectly normal life to this point? How could there be anything wrong with him? Visit Readle. Me for extra chapters. So why was Anya saying this stuff now? Anya looked away and Lionel shook his head. He found this woman too difficult to read. He just needed to focus on healing himself, so that he could more confidently take his next steps. It was about time he checked in on Elther and the Oryx. The guards of the treasure house were stunned to see two youths approaching, but they soon had no choice but to accept the reality. A duo of such youthful bronze crafters was something they had never seen before. This storehouse was shared between both force crafters and force pill crafters. It had shelves hundreds of meters tall, and an eerily structured organization that made one think that someone had dedicated their lives to ensuring that everything would be perfect. Without much thought or a word toward Anya, Lionel found the section of healing herbs before he realized something especially intriguing. He didn't need to spend his guild points on these herbs. He just needed to use Dream Sculpt on them. That way, he could save his points for ores he could use in the future. He doubted that this treasure vault would have the ores he would need for his next divine armor. But that didn't matter. He could do a lot with what was before him right now. He just had to be quick about it. The matters related to Anya had already been thrown to the back of his mind. It didn't take Lionel long to find several healing herbs with light elemental attributes. Though most were fourth-dimensional, there were a handful of fifth-dimensional ones. Each of these were worth hundreds of thousands of points though, something that truly put Lionel's million points into perspective. Lionel, who was about to get lost in his own world, was suddenly startled. His head snapped back, only to find Anya had once again appeared by his side. Wait, had she appeared there, or had she never left? Now that Lionel thought about it, he wasn't sure of the answer to that. What are you doing? Lionel asked. Anya blinked. I have 0 guild points. I don't have a sugar mama like you do. She spoke as though this was the most obvious thing ever. Why wouldn't she follow him around since she didn't have points of her own to spend? Lionel was speechless. Last chapter of the day. Didn't have the energy to start writing the chaos that's about to ensue. LMAO. Chapter 939. Published at 13th of June, 2022. For 04:55 AM. Chapter 939. Twinkling Bell Lily. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 939. Twinkling Bell Lily. This girl was truly too loose with her lips. When she wasn't saying things that made no sense, she was teasing him as though they had known each other for decades. She was really too difficult to get a read on, and Lionel also had a feeling that her veil was only making it more difficult. In the end, Lionel could only shrug. He had thought that Anya was coming with him because she had free reign over the items in this treasure house. After all, with how the elders treated her, likely due to her status, he had made certain assumptions. But it seemed that instead, she was just stuck to him like glue, like a little girl chasing after her big brother. It reminded Lionel a bit of little Nana. He couldn't help but think back to that adorable little blue-haired girl. The trouble was that even little Nana was far more mature than Anya. Lionel found that his experience in the Valiant Zone had made him far more stoic and level-headed. Even when he had been with his brothers, he hadn't joked around with them as much as he usually did. What he couldn't tell was if that was a part of him maturing, or if he was just becoming jaded. Of course, he could turn his charisma on and off like a faucet, but was it really the same if he had to consciously act like that? It felt somewhat robotic. How many people could have heard Anya's advice about being too scary and immediately change on a dime? Maybe Lionel was the only one. But a product of that was the realization that he was a bit too good at artificially producing his personality. Something like that made it difficult for him to tell who the real him was. Was he charismatic because he wanted to be, and that was just the type of person he was? Or was he just abusing his emotional intelligence to get what he wanted out of the world? Lionel shook his head again. It felt like Anya's presence was forcing him to introspect. It was an uncomfortable feeling. But if there was anything Lionel was good at, it was stonewalling those kind of things. In one moment he had a pensive look in his eye. In the next, it vanished with a calculating light, scanning the array of light elemental healing herbs before him. Anya's irises twinkled with something imperceptible, but she stood obediently to the side, her sweet fragrance hanging in the air with a strange magnetism. Lionel, though, didn't seem to notice, his mind completely focused. As beautiful as Anya was, to the point where Lionel was certain if she removed her veil, she wouldn't lose out to Aina in the slightest, there was still only one woman who could ever distract him from a task at hand. And Anya wasn't that woman. All the like herbs are here. Convenient, I don't even need to move. There are 38 variations of herbs in the fourth dimension. There are 3 variations for the fifth dimension. A fourth dimensional mage art might be useful if I want to mass heal a large group of individuals. But my priority right now is forming the most powerful healing spell I can muster. Ro, I need an herb that not only matches the light element, but it also needs to be one that is compatible with Snow Force, so it can synergize well with the healing branch of my Snowy Star Owl lineage factor. If those are the parameters I set, then there are only 3 of the fourth dimension that fit, and only 1 of the fifth dimension. Visit Readel. Me for extra chapters. Lionel ignored the 3 fourth-dimensional herbs for a moment, training his eyes on the 5th-dimensional one he felt responded the best to his Snow Force. By all measures, it was quite a beautiful herb. It had the 6 petals and delicate bell shape of a lily. It was a gorgeous white color, and had veins of white that would even sometimes spring to life, dancing above its body for a moment, and sprinkling down a heavenly light before going to rest once again. It had a long stem that attached it to 3 other companions identical to it. However, what was curious about this long stem was the fact it was covered in a white fur that waved about as though it had a life of its own. However, even this was just the tip of the iceberg. Amidst the 6 petals, coming out from the center, several stamens that seemed shaped of pure gold metals sprung upward. On their ends, each of them held a twinkling gold bell. Every time the flower swayed, these bells would release a delicate sound that tickled the ears, filling one with warmth. Or rather, That's what would have happened had the twinkling bell lily not been enclosed by a glass case. Lionel didn't waste much time, immediately beginning to dream sculpt the twinkling bell lily. The root of this flower's artistic conception seems to be the ringing bells. Even its name says so. But I feel like the fur covering its stem is actually just as important. This beautiful plant is actually a bit carnivorous. No wonder it resonated so well with my snowy star owl lineage factor. It might be more beast than plant. Lionel didn't know much about force herbs after all. He wasn't a force pill crafter. However, combining the dictionary and his dream sculpt allowed him to understand an herb far better than even an expert herbologist would. How fascinating! Lionel had come looking for a force herb that could replace Grand Heal. But he had never expected to find a combination heal attack mage art like this. If he shifted it to a light earth elemental mage art, the results might be even more shocking. However, for now, Twinkling Lily Bell's blessing. At that moment, Lionel's eyes snapped open, his body beginning to glow with a fierce light. Chapter 940. Published at 13th of June, 2022, for 04:54 AM. Chapter 940. Be careful if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 940. Be careful right then. Anya's eyes widened. She had been wondering what Lionel was doing, but when she saw the result, her golden irises were completely filled with shock. At that moment, a lily manifested around Lionel. A strong surge of light elemental force causing the surrounding winds to pick up and surge. The sound of delicate chimes resounded, the golden bells dancing above Lionel's head. Every time they swayed, a sprinkle of golden light fell upon him, attaching to his skin and sinking into his body. Without a word, Lionel cast the spell 17 times before he finally exhaled a breath and gripped his fists, his body finally feeling light again as he expelled the last of the black ash that had been inside of him. It took 17 casts and 70% of my stamina just to heal from one split-second usage. This innate node of mine is really the bane of my existence. Lionel shook his head and chuckled. Though he had seemed fine all this time, he really only had about half his usual strength. He could only function normally thanks to dream sense dulling his pain. This Twinkling Lily series of mage arts I've come up with aren't bad. The Bell's Blessing only has about 20% of its max healing potential, but it still did so well. Should I find some Star Force healing herbs that could be used with my vital Star Force? Lionel thought for a moment before he shook his head. His vital Star Force was too precious and took too long to replenish after he used it. It was best to reserve it entirely for using Star Fusion at a critical moment. As for why Lionel had only used Bell's Blessing, and not the full version of Twinkling Lily, that secret was rooted in the hidden carnivorous nature of the Force herb. He felt it wasn't appropriate to test the of the mage art's capabilities here. Lionel moved on without a word after dream sculpting the 3 fourth-dimensional Force herbs. He had already decided which fifth-dimensional ores he would use for his metal body, so he didn't need to think about it. Though his merit points weren't enough to trade for a ton of fifth-dimensional Force herbs, ores were a bit different in this regard since they were sold in quantities of kilograms. At the very least, he should be able to get enough to take a first step into and solidify his stance in Tier 1. Anya was so stunned she forgot to follow for a second. Did he just? She looked from the twinkling bell lily to Lionel's disappearing back and back again. She was certain, that spell. It had given her the same feel of the plant right before her. How had he done that? How was that even possible? It took him 10 minutes, maybe, to create a technique that could be passed down in bronze organizations for generations to come. Row. Ah. Anya picked up her dress and dashed after Lionel, catching up quite quickly considering he wasn't exactly sprinting. She continued to look at him as though he was some sort of monster, following closely behind. Fifth-dimensional star core will still be my foundation, upgrading from fourth-dimensional. I'll replace refractive gold with dancing lantern, or an I'll replace blazing night with a more volatile fuel type, or in devil's shavings. Oregon. Lionel still felt the star core was the best foundational ore for him. Dancing lantern ore worked similarly to refractive gold in that it could consume and concentrate the light elemental. But whereas refractive gold was dangerous and could turn even a benign ray of sunlight into a deadly attack, a property that made Lionel's sniper rifle especially dangerous, dancing lantern ore was very docile. Dancing lantern ore could accumulate the light element to the point of saturation. Once it reached that point, its internal structure would begin to move and shift, thus the dancing part of its name. This dancing wasn't just an optical illusion though. Once it reached this state, it was possible to choose one of two paths. The first was a steady output of power and the second was an immediate and violent burst that would put even refractive gold to shame. This made this ore quite good for armors, shields and the exterior of vessels, or the body of weapons. Roye, finally, Devil's Shavings ore was like a nuclear bomb in comparison to blazing night Oregon. However, much like its weaker counterpart, it was able to maintain a steady and relatively safe form in its complete form. Only after it was chipped, and its shavings were introduced to flames would it cause a catastrophe. It didn't take long for Lionel to find what he needed. He wasn't stingy and directly spent all million of his points, and was even lucky enough to gather enough ores to enter Tier 3. Of course, he would need to be patient and couldn't enter it directly. However, it was possible to use the silver tablet to loosen and erase his bottlenecks before moving forward. But something told Lionel that he couldn't casually bring that tablet out just anywhere. So he would need a secluded place first. Visit Riedel. Me for extra chapters. Anya remained silent as Lionel picked out his herbs, but the light in her eyes seemed to dim somewhat as she did. If Lionel had been paying attention, he might have even been able to notice that she sighed as well. But he had grown accustomed to ignoring her completely so that he could focus his mind. Only after he was finished and stored his things away did he finally look at her again. "Where will you go now? It can't be that you'll follow me home, right?" Lionel asked with a smile. Anya pouted. "What would be wrong with me doing that? Are you trying to get rid of me?" Lionel's lip twitched. He was indeed trying to get rid of her. He had things to do, he couldn't drag someone he barely knew around with him. Though he had to admit, she was a pretty good shield. Thanks to her, things had gone far more smoothly than he thought they would. Just as Lionel was thinking of something to say in reply, a light lit on Anya's wrist, causing her playful expression to come with a touch of cold. "It seems I have to go," she said lightly. Her voice was just as enticing as it always was. But for some reason, she seemed 10 years older without aging a single second. "Oh." Lionel blinked. "Be careful then." Anya's brows rose at Lionel's choice of words. She opened her mouth to say something before hesitating. You be careful too," she finally said. "This galaxy isn't as simple as you think it is. Your ambitions might let you down." Lionel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean by that?" "My ambitions?" The birth of just a single planet of a certain caliber is enough to change the destiny of an entire galaxy. I'm sure you're smart enough to understand what that means. Lionel's pupils constricted. But before he could ask more, Anya seemed to vanish right before his eyes. It was like he was both aware and unaware of what was happening at the same time. As though she had both always been there, and never been there. What? Lionel suddenly realized that he had no idea just how strong Anya was. Before he could even think any further, he felt several strong auras sweep through his surroundings. He didn't even have a chance to figure out what was going on before they all locked onto him. Lionel realized in an instant that their intentions weren't kind, but at the same time, he was confused. He was still in the guild. How could he be targeted like this? And for what reason? Author's note. Oops. It seems that I'm bad at predicting chapter lengths as usual. El Mayo. The action starts tomorrow. I guess decam. Chapter 941. Published at 13th of June 2022, 4:04 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 941. Status: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 941 status. Lionel took a look around and sighed. If those auras could kill, he probably would have exploded several times over by now. He didn't believe that Anya's disappearance was a coincidence. But he also didn't think that she was involved in this. It was likely more accurate to say that whoever was moving in on him now had been waiting for exactly this moment. It seemed that his protective charm was gone now. They're not moving? Lionel's brows raised slightly. After locking onto him, these hostile auras didn't seem intent on moving in on him just yet. It was as though they don't think I can sense them? Lionel suddenly realized something. He described this sweeping feeling as auras, but the truth was that they were just strands of internal sight. This was clearly different from an aura, so why was it that he felt that this was an appropriate description? Beyond that, how could he tell they were hostile? King's might. Lionel's gaze narrowed. He understood that this grasp of aura's artistic conception, the emotions and mental states of those around him, that he had were all related to this lineage factor. Whether it was his creation of new mage arts or a comprehension of a person's mental state, all the way up to even being able to influence another's opinion of him. It all stemmed from this. I see. So they think I'm unable to sense them. Lionel almost chuckled to himself. Though as a crafter, he definitely had strong internal sight. Those that were targeting him right now likely believed that his control was far greater than his raw internal sight. They believed that even if they couldn't match him in control, the quality of their internal sight should be beyond his since they were stronger. As such, they didn't need to worry about being detected. Another possibility was that these people were completely unaware of his level to begin with. After all, they seemed to be cautious about acting on the guild's grounds, and were likely waiting for him to step out. In that case, they might not be related to the guild at all. Not related to the guild? Targeting me? Waiting for an opportunity. It's either the Milky Way Guild or Shield Cross Stars. But the Milky Way Guild wouldn't dare to be so brazen. I would dare to assume that over half of their profit is reliant on force crafters and force pill crafters. Offending someone who just became a Tier 3 bronze crafter isn't something they would dare to do. At least not so openly. Shield Cross Stars finally caught up to me, huh? Well, they sure chose a nice time. Lionel looked around. It was a shame. If it was the guild targeting him, he wouldn't have minded sweeping this treasure house clean. But he had already decided not to burn down bridges unnecessarily. Lionel concluded his deductions in a split moment, his expression never changing. Those who were currently monitoring him would never guess that in just that second, he had already guessed who they were, knew of exactly where they were, and understood their purpose. Well, since it's like this, maybe this could be an opportunity. Lionel slicked his hair back, rolling his neck as he stepped toward the exit of the treasure house. His face didn't seem to give anything away. His gait was casual and his expression carefree. Visit Readel. Me for extra chapters. When Lionel stepped out of the guild house, he was greeted by the fresh scent of this world once again. Long stretches of green grass, perfectly paved roads, little pockets of exotic flowers and fish ponds. It was quite a beautiful sight to behold. Lionel's bare feet glided across this grass, his sweatpants having been rolled up to his calves. By this point, he had even removed his shirt, revealing an exceptionally cut body that pulsed with a bronze life and vitality. To the current Lionel, wearing clothing into battle was just asking for them to be destroyed. There was only so much the silver chain dangling from his neck could do about it. He seemed to be meditating as he walked, his body entering an odd state. Lionel allowed his king's might to be the lens he saw the world through. It gave him the feeling of someone riding an emotional high, completely in tune with the world surrounding him. It was then that the alarms of the world began to sound. High above in the skies, 3 warships came into view, each about 20 meters from tip to end. They had a sleek black exterior and a platform upon which 3 men wearing a very familiar uniform stood. Long robes split into 4 at the waist, allowing the metallic leg armor they wore to shimmer beneath the sunlight every time the wind blew. And most importantly, a star fused with a cross hanging from their lapels. Lionel smiled lightly, his eyes half closed. Those uniforms are still so cool. A pillar of light connected the hovering ships to the ground below, projecting a force art onto the ground. The moment the force art was burned into being, several squadrons of Shield Cross Star officers appeared at the guild house gates, taking up formation with those who had already taken position at the helm. Lionel didn't recognize most of those who took the front position, but there was one man that made everything click for him. It was none other than Ignarel. At that moment, Ignarel stood a respectful half-step behind a man who seemed to be a few years younger than him. By now, Ignarel had already switched into Shield Cross Star's signature uniform. Seeing such a lineup, Lionel realized that the charges that the person in collusion with Era had levied against him were not small in the slightest. These people didn't know the origin of Lionel's charges, nor did they understand that he was being framed. All they knew was that Lionel had colluded with a variant invalid, evaded arrest, and most importantly, was a Tier 3 fugitive, a status that was high enough to warrant him being hunted down by the entire galaxy. Chapter 942. Published at 13th of June, 2022, 4:04:53 AM. Chapter 942. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 942. Evacuate the surroundings. Tier 4 fugitive, Lionel Morales, stop all form of resistance. The voice came booming, but it made Lionel raise an eyebrow. Tier 4? I thought that previous guy said that if I wasn't handed in within 2 hours, I would become a Tier 3 fugitive. It seems that never got the chance to take effect. Lionel had no idea how lucky he was that this was the case. In fact, it could be said that Scytha was only using this as a threat to force Earth's hand. The threshold between a Tier 4 and Tier 3 fugitive was the difference between this matter being handled by an individual galaxy, or pulling in the forces of others. What did this mean? It meant that up to Tier 4, one's fugitive status was still relative to the strength of your galaxy. But, the moment you stepped into Tier 3, you would be the target of all Shield Cross Star branches across the dimensional verse. It could be said that the moment Lionel stepped outside of this galaxy, he would be a free man. But with how difficult it was to travel between galaxies, how could they believe that it would be a simple matter for Lionel to do so? And even then, where would he go? All this said, being Tier 4 was also equivalent to being among the most wanted of a galaxy. And the amount of vitriol pointed Lionel's way spoke volumes about this. Lionel's palm shifted slightly, causing a beautifully crafted wooden spear to appear in his hand. It was carved of a deep black grain, and it was continuous with its wooden blade. It was clear that the whole thing had been cut out of a single piece. Though Lionel hadn't said anything, his actions were clear as day for all to see. The laziness in his eyes seemed to vanish, his gait still steady as he walked toward the gates. Ignarel frowned. He had felt that something was off about this matter from the very beginning. The fact that Lionel was able to enter such a world without an alert going off in the first place was ridiculous. Then there was the fact it took hours to get back to him that this Lionel was actually a Tier 4 fugitive. If the system was always so terribly slow, then how would they protect the people? It all smelt of someone trying to cover up and protect Lionel. But now that the truth was out, he couldn't just stand idly by, right? The wind pressure of the hovering ships pressed down, flattening the stretches of grass, and causing the ponds of water to ripple wildly. Lionel's own hair danced about, its short strands giving him a sort of carefree air. I'm quite disappointed in Shield Cross Stars. Lionel suddenly spoke. Despite not having the same amplifiers his enemy did, he still managed to cut through it all. His king's might didn't seem capable of being suppressed, even by volume. To accuse an innocent man without evidence, trial or proper proceedings. Is this the so-called protector of the universe you all claim to be? Lionel decided that he might as well try to talk. But he couldn't take an approach that was too soft either. The holes in this charge against him were too numerous. He colluded with a variant invalid to attack his own planet? The very planet he was technically in line to potentially inherit? Then, when he was going to be punished for his actions, his grandfather, the ruler of said planet, still chose to step out to save him. From top to bottom, it made little sense. Just a little investigation would tell anyone this. So Lionel knew that he couldn't take a casual stance with this. Anyone with half a brain would understand that there was something wrong. However, just in case, he still chose to say something. Visit Readle. Me for extra chapters. Unsurprisingly, he didn't receive an answer. The younger man Ignarel stood respectfully behind, raised up a hand, before pointing 2 fingers forward. Captain Snyder. Agnarel spoke softly. However, a side glance from the younger man was all he needed to stop his words in their tracks. Sometimes, the truth wasn't what mattered. Agnarel's gaze narrowed. If they were going to offend Lionel, they might as well offend him all the way. There were no chances for half measures. In that moment, a squadron usually led by Agnarel shot forward. They were usually tasked with guard duties on this world. In fact, amongst them, there were two very familiar faces in Rio and Xander. It was no surprise that these two had the most sinister expressions of the lot. While the others were simply doing their duty, it clearly meant more to them. They no longer wore their flashy, golden, diamond-encrusted armor. The change made their auras sharper and far less of a joke. It seemed that they did have some skill beyond being lackeys to noble men and women far above their station. But did it matter? Lionel sighed lightly, his body stretching. He felt a bit stiff after just healing from so many injuries, but with as much emphasis as he placed on his flexibility and training it, it wasn't long before he felt light and limber. The group of 5 had already cut the distance between themselves and him. Should I kill them? Lionel sighed again, shaking his head. Forget it. I'll just decide depending on the situation. Die. Lionel suddenly found 2 spears piercing toward him at once. He looked down at them, meeting the hostile gazes of both Rio and Xander. Before their blades could even pierce through his exposed abdomen, the situation changed. In an eruption of ash, their weapons crumbled to nothing. They continued forward in a piercing motion, but without their spears, they stabbed at empty air, making it seem like more of a comedy routine than the instigation of battle. A light glow coated Lionel's black wooden spear. Before the two could react, their arms flew into the air in a rain of blood, their cries of agony filling the skies. Chapter 943. Published at 13th of June, 2022, for 04:52 AM. Chapter 943. Pumping blood. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 943. Pumping blood. Rio and Xander slid along the grass, gripping at their armless shoulders with the only hand they had left. Pain was etched across their faces, a mixture of surprise and horror hiding within. Lionel might have needed a few exchanges to defeat a usual tier for existence, since he wasn't using his sniper rifle. But who asked Rio and Xander to use the exact weapon that was completely useless against him? Lionel swept a gaze over the 3 remaining members before checking the surroundings once again. It seemed that the guild house was quiet, almost too quiet. A part of that was because they hadn't allowed many people in to accommodate Anya to begin with. But another part was likely that Shield Cross Stars had already warned them all to stay out of the way. I should get out of here as quickly as possible. I don't have the luxury of using this for training. Who knows if they have more reinforcements coming or not? Lionel didn't want to fall into a trap of overestimating himself. As confident as he felt right now, it was exactly at such a point that he was the most vulnerable. His gaze turned cold, a dull fog of violet hanging around him as though to curtail the world. Lionel's steps shifted, a road of star force appearing in his path as he appeared amidst the 3 remaining warriors. Harmonic spear. Lionel's sweeping spear left several afterimages in the air, making it difficult to tell just which trajectory was real and what was fake. The 3 warriors were immediately overwhelmed, blocking what they thought was real only to end up pushing their weapons through fake images. Before they could react, they found their bodies being torn into, Lionel's spear force slicing their flesh like a hot knife through butter. As expected of a tactical unit, they were so focused on being a part of a team that none of them got the chance to use their abilities before it was too late. Without a chance, they could only watch as their blood sprinkled upon the greenery, dyeing it crimson. Lionel's head suddenly tilted to the side, a whistling projectile streaking just by his head. In the distance, an archer's pupils constricted. He had been certain that Lionel wouldn't react in time. He had even shot the moment Lionel was most confident in his victory. And yet, Lionel seemed to swerve out of the way in a motion that was almost too natural. Lionel swept his spear toward his right hand, his left palm flipping over to reveal a sniper rifle. Before anyone could react, he fired. Bang! A look of horror froze on the archer's visage. Despite standing on a building over a kilometer away, there was no room for dodging. In the split second he hesitated, shocked that Lionel had actually dodged, he had already sealed his own fate. A line of gold tore through the skies, shooting through several discs of reflective gold before landing on its target. Though the range was too far for anyone to get a feel of just how bloody the end result was, a sinking feeling still sunk into the pits of their stomachs. Lionel put his sniper rifle away in a motion, just as smooth as the one he had used to bring it out. He had figured that there were likely snipers casting a net around him, but they clearly had their own methods of concealing themselves even from Lionel's internal sight. In that case, he could only wait for them to expose themselves. The moment they did, they could consider their lives forfeit. Visit Readle.me for extra chapters. Lionel rose his now free palm, spreading out his fingers and arching them toward the ground. In that moment, the metallic leg sleeves of the 5 warriors groaning splintered into their numerous pieces, rising up into the air and circling around him. Lionel had realized that this piece of their uniform was actually extremely valuable. Not only did they use 5th-dimensional herb ore as a foundation, but each was constructed of an extra unique 5th-dimensional, or that he guessed must match the affinity of the officer that wore them. It was clear that the wealth of shield cross stars was beyond Lionel's imagining to be capable of doing this. So he had no qualms about taking advantage. Angnerl stood a half-step behind Captain Snyder with a solemn expression on his face. Was this the combat prowess someone at Tier 1 should have? Or was this the fearsomeness of crafters? As though to answer his question, little Tali appeared like a river of silver, floating around Lionel as though it had become some sort of enigmatic shawl. In the blink of an eye, all the metals were swallowed up by the metal spirit, causing its size to expand. All units forward. Captain Snyder roared. The guild house grounds were suddenly flooded. Lionel counted that there were almost 100 of these ground units. And unlike the group he had met in the Milky Way Guild, they were trained to work together and most definitely wouldn't get in each other's way. However, Lionel didn't seem to have eyes for them. Instead, his internal sight was still locked onto those 3 floating ships whose pressure had still not let up. Namely, his senses were locked onto the 3 men, one for each, that stood at the helm. Their hands were clasped down to their backs, their expressions not giving anything away as they observed the battlefield. Lionel's lips suddenly curled, his heart rate increasing as he continued to observe these 3 men. His smile became a grin, his gaze tinging with a bit of red as his aura blazed, the temperature in the surroundings skyrocketing to the point despite there being no flame, the grass in the surroundings still turned to ash. Lionel's blood pumped, his pale violet eyes gaining a brighter hue with every passing moment. A pillar of flame suddenly erupted as Lionel shot forward. He appeared before the first of the warriors in less than a single breath, his spear piercing forward. Meteoric impact. Chapter 944. Published at 13th of June, 2022, for 04 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 944. Best at. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 944. Best at. An eruption of fire turned whatever blood and gore there would have been to ash. In that moment, a headless corpse fell to the ground, much of its shoulders and collarbone burnt to black. Lionel's fingers flickered, causing another pair of metallic leg sleeves to shoot to little Tali. His feet glided past several attacks, his left hand continuously tapping in the air. The speed of his fingers was so fast that concentrated blasts of air would arc downward every time he struck. It was as though he was playing the piano on the back of the wind, his veins pulsing with an undying power. Meteoric impact. Whenever Lionel got even a semblance of breathing room, the rhythmic tapping of his fingers would come to a halt, and his spear would pierce out like a spiraling fire dragon, shaking the air and imploding the head of yet another warrior. Every time one died, another set of metallic leg sleeves would be added to little Tali, and the rhythmic tapping would grow faster, and somehow more controlled and deliberate. The snapping of Lionel's fingers became so fast that the sound barrier began to shatter with every tap. The speed was even beyond what Lionel could casually reach within such a strong world. Lionel sidestepped, allowing a pike to pass between his ribcage and elbow. He swung his arm down, pinching the polearm onto his body and twisting. A resounding snap caught the warrior off guard. Before he could realize that Lionel had targeted a weak point in his weapon's craft to shatter it, an elbow glowing with bronze runes was already traveling toward his face. The sickening sound of shattering bone resounded through the already rowdy battlefield. Meteoric impact. Lionel's visage had entered a state of cold excitement. He was hardly thinking about his next action before he took it. He subconsciously felt that he didn't need to calculate things in a battle of this level. And the result was his entering a state of free-flowing where his spear domain lineage factor took charge. A blinding golden spear appeared on his forehead long before anyone realized what was happening. Then, without even considering the consequences, Lionel applied a spear technique to his elbow. Bang! The head of the warrior imploded. This time, the explosion was much less controlled as compared to what it usually was with Lionel's spear, resulting in a tail of wild blackish-red flame to jet outward for several meters, catching a wave of warriors off guard. They hurried their force to block, but the heat was excruciating, some of them even feeling their skin being boiled in real time. Unfortunately for them, Lionel instinctually took advantage of this, as though a predator stalking prey. He appeared in their midst, his harmonic spear activating. He stood amidst the flames, allowing them to trickle across his exposed torso. Yet, it seemed to hardly affect him in the slightest. The confusion of fire, screams and countless spears covering the surroundings left the warriors at a loss for how to react. In the blink of an eye, half a dozen fell to Lionel's spear, never to rise again. Lionel released a roar that shook the skies, his hair and gaze slowly gaining a crimson hue to them. His flames only seemed to become more powerful with each passing moment. Now, every time his finger tapped at the air, a ring of fire would spread out from it, turning the lush greenery of the guild house into a land of black ash. In that moment, little Tali finally rose high into the skies, pile after pile of herb or falling to the ground. With just a single look, it was possible to see hundreds of kilograms of fifth-dimensional herb ore, an amount that was practically a fortune to anyone who wasn't a crafter. However, it was still continuing to pile. In just a few minutes, little Tali had separated out the metallic leg sleeves to their fundamental components, effectively undoing all of the crafter's work. Just like that, several ores shaped into perfect javelins appeared. They looked like large needles, each 3 meters long and each being thicker toward their center, and tapering out to their ends. Visit Readel. Me for extra chapters. Infernal Cyclone. Lionel's spear began to spin in his hands. Every revolution it completed formed another wheel of fire that jetted out with his spear as the center. Some of these wheels of fire were vertical, some horizontal, some diagonal. They ravaged Lionel's surroundings so thoroughly that trenches dozens of meters deep were torn up. Scatter! One of the warriors roared. Lionel didn't pursue even as his infernal cyclone ravaged the warriors around him. Instead, his spear vanished, his right hand stretching out to his side. As though it had a mind of its own, one of the 6 javelins little Tali had just completed fell into his palm, its aura completely changing as though Lionel was its one and only master. Lionel's stance shifted, his right foot rotating to the back and his left anchoring his front. Deep semicircular lines followed the path of his soles, his back flexing and his chest expanding as he cocked the javelin back. However, what shocked those around him the most wasn't the fact he had completed several bronze-grade crafts while in the middle of battle, nor were they surprised that he had used their own equipment to do so, nor was it even that he dared to use such untested crafts with his life on the line. No, none of that was surprising. What shook them to the core was that his gaze had suddenly locked onto the ships floating in the air. The fiendish grin on Lionel's face only seemed to grow wilder, his muscles bulging to the point every individual fiber could be seen. He, Lionel Morales, was a decent sniper. He guessed that he was also alright at using the bow. But if there was a form of marksmanship he was the absolute best at, it was most definitely throwing. Bang! Lionel's body shot out like a loaded spring. The sound of the javelin leaving his hand was no different from an iron ball leaving a cannon. Even the earth beneath his feet shattered, sinking downward what was at least half a meter. The javelin drew a line through the skies, whistling wind and concentric circles of shattered air spiraling in its wake. Without anyone being able to react, it tore into the hull of the leftmost flying vessel before the world fell into silence. A moment later, chaos ensued. Chapter 945. Published at 13th of June, 2022, for 04 and 51 seconds AM. Chapter 945. Ablaze. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 945. Ablaze. The javelin tore through the hull of the leftmost ship as though a hot knife through butter. There wasn't an ounce of resistance and the hole it created wasn't even visible to the naked eye. It felt like nothing would happen for just a few moments and many almost sighed breaths of relief. As scary as Lionel was when he wielded a spear, whenever he became a marksman, it felt as though they were all standing in the presence of a demon overlord. It felt that no matter which of them he chose to lock onto, they would die without recourse. Unfortunately, they never got a chance to breathe that sigh of relief. That javelin wasn't bad. I think it combined a few lightning and water elemental ores. This will probably be the slowest acting one. 3, 2 bang, bang, bang. The nonchalant man who stood at the helm of the ship almost lost his balance, his hands unable to remain clasped at his back. The chain explosions his ship was undergoing only became worse with every passing moment. In that moment, another javelin had already appeared in Lionel's hand, causing the atmosphere to shift once again. The pupils of the two remaining nonchalant men constricted, their hands already leaving their backs as their auras surged. However, what they hadn't expected was for Lionel's second throw to still target the leftmost ship, something that most definitely caught the man at the helm off guard. But what happened next made them regret not stopping the javelin at all costs. The ship suddenly swayed, its explosion sending it careening into the middle ship. It was as though the explosions were perfectly crafted by Lionel to result in this. There was nothing they could do to stop the chain result. The moment the left and middle ship collided, a spiraling implosion resounded, only for Lionel to throw out a third and fourth javelin that resulted in the both of them colliding with the rightmost. The explosions were so loud and endless that even the long-since evacuated residents could hear the commotion from hundreds of kilometers away. The skies sparked as though a network of fireworks had been let free. The clouds were singed black and ash rained down along with meteors of fiery metallic parts. Lionel stood amidst the destruction, his expression unmoved. From start to finish, a second archer hadn't dared to target him, probably for fear of ending up like their other comrade. For some reason, even when Lionel was the most distracted, it felt like his vice grip was still holding onto their necks. As for Lionel himself, he felt like lava was rushing through his veins. He knew that the battle was over now. He could just hop into the segmented cube and use its new functions to leave this place now that there was nothing that could immediately pursue him. But he still longed for battle. In that moment before, he had almost aimed the javelins at the men standing on the helms despite knowing just how stupid that would have been. Lionel shook his head. Using dream sense, his raging battle intent was dulled as it split between over 1,000,000 minds. In an instant he regained all his rationality, the slight red tinge of his violet hair and pupils vanishing. Little Tali descended, wrapping itself around Lionel's wrist. As for the remaining 2 javelins, Lionel stored them away before summoning the segmented cube. Lionel swept a gaze toward Ignarel and Captain Snyder, causing both to tense up. Boy! A roar sounded from the wreckage. Lionel had never expected his javelins to kill those 3 men. And clearly they weren't feeling just a small bit pissed. Too bad he didn't have the intention of sticking around. Visit Readel. Me for extra chapters. Maybe had they attacked with the original group, things might have become troublesome. But since they had chosen to attack as though they were lofty and above everything else, they only had themselves to blame for the result. The segmented cube shifted, its numerous jigsaw-like puzzle pieces expanding and contracting until it reformed itself into a black ship made of the same pieces. This ship pulsed with blue lights, looking as though it might collapse at any moment. The crevices between the puzzle pieces were clearly visible, though it gave it a beautiful, exotic sort of look, It was also difficult to tell whether the vessel would actually hold up. Lionel, though, felt that if he couldn't trust this ship, then there was no ship in the world worthy of his trust. Halt! Lionel cocked an eyebrow. Was he actually supposed to listen to that? Or? Lionel shook his head, stepping into the ship. Soon, his vision was filled with a complex series of control. Puzzle pieces hovered in the air in odd patterns before surging toward Lionel, covering his fingers. In that moment, Lionel's nerves were fused with the ship. The only thing they didn't share was pain. It felt as though he had gained a whole new body. Just the sensory overload alone was enough to overwhelm a normal individual. Lionel shook his head. Even for him, it was hard to handle. After all, this ship was at a sixth-dimensional standard. But it was also ironically a perfect way to train his mind as well. Just riding this ship to come to the guild's world had helped his mind improve by a few hundred split minds. The ship shot into the skies with such speed it felt like it simply teleported into the stratosphere. It was then that a massive, dome-like force art activated. However, it might as well have been a thin sheet of paper. It broke into tiny shards of glass, sprinkling down over the world as it trembled. They had hardly registered what happened when Lionel had already vanished into the distance, traveling at speeds that were hard to fathom. A silence fell over the guild world. It felt as though they had just witnessed history. The name Lionel Morales was practically burned into their minds. And soon, it would set a wildfire ablaze across the galaxy. Chapter 946. Published at 13th of June, 2022, for 04:50 AM. Chapter 946. Crime pays if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 946. Crime pays. On a corner of the guild world, Anya sighed and shook her head. It was hard to tell exactly what sort of place she was in. All the walls were white and had a slight glow to them. However, there were no windows or even a door. The only thing in this room outside of Anya herself was a statue of a woman with a beauty that felt almost computer-generated. She was too perfect, without a single flaw and without a weakness. Whether it was the symmetry of her face down to the ratio of her hips to waist, to her bust and bottom, even the individual strands of her hair. It was all immaculate. This statue radiated an aura that Lionel would find familiar, having sensed it once before in his life. However, even to someone who had never sensed it before, they would feel the need to bow and prostrate themselves before this woman. All this said, as difficult as it was to tell exactly where Anya was, deciding what it was she was sighing about was even more difficult. At that moment, Anya's bracelet rang once again. She bowed toward the statue and took a step toward the blank walls, vanishing as though she had walked through an invisible doorway. "You're trying to encroach on my territory?" The voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. This time, Anya was in a simply decorated room without an ounce of anything special to it. It seemed like any other luxurious hotel room, except for the fact this wasn't a hotel at all. There is no such thing as encroachment when it comes to the word of the goddess. Anya replied lightly. "How sanctimonious of you. It might not be an encroachment to you, but if I see any of your disciples, I'll kill first and ask questions later." "Is there a need to be like this?" Anya asked with a sigh. "I'm getting tired of that loftier-than-thou tone. It would do you good to remember exactly what it is your goddess represents. No amount of pure light and white clothing can wash your stains away. I've already given you my warning. Don't test me." Anya shook her head. Earth has already entered the fifth dimension. Their fold of reality has already expanded past just their solar system, and has consumed a dozen others. At this rate, they'll truly be on pace to swallow the whole galaxy by the time they are prepared to enter the seventh dimension. This piece of the pie isn't something any one person can swallow, and to try to do so is a foolish dream. Your attempts to monopolize these gains for yourself will end horribly for you. There is a harmony that must be achieved. All Anya received in return was a sneer she could practically hear through the phone. "You make stealing the territory of another sound so noble. People like you disgust me the most." The person didn't wait for Anya's response and simply ended the call. They had already given their warning. They didn't have the patience to say anything more. The longer they spoke with this Anya, the more they wanted to watch her head implode like a hammered watermelon. Anya shook her head once again and sighed. Lionel took deep breaths, beads of sweat falling down his brow. Much of this was from the difficulty of controlling the ship, but another large part was rooted in the fact he had entered that battle with just 30% of his stamina remaining. He had avoided using mage arts as a result for fear that he would be sucked dry before he could actually do anything. But this isn't bad too. We made a nice little profit. Lionel grinned. Visit Riedel. Me for extra chapters. Lionel thought of the herb or he had gained. He had only taken the metallic leg sleeves of about 60 or so warriors of shield cross stars. Yet he had gotten over 1,000 kilograms of fifth-dimensional herb or out of it. It seemed that crime really did pay. Lionel had half a mind to target the shield cross stars offices, so that he could build up the wealth he was lacking. But in the end he decided against this. The current Lionel couldn't see the true depths of shield cross stars. Without fully understanding his opponent, it would be foolish to provoke them too much. At the same time, Anya's warning still lingered in his mind, making him realize that cornering this galaxy wouldn't be nearly as easy as he thought it would be. In that case, he had to change his plans. He still needed resources and information, but how he would use them would have to change. I should also return to Earth since that's where the boys are. It's about time we regroup and make some moves. Lionel weighed his options and decided to put his other thoughts aside. He would return to Earth first, gather everyone up, then move forward. The chess pieces on the board were moving too fast. Lionel wasn't even at the point where he could see the whole board to begin with, but he was already being overwhelmed by a small corner of it. No, I can't return to Earth empty-handed. Also, the Milky Way Guild has yet to properly suffer for their actions at that moment. A talisman lit up within Lionel's spatial ring. At first he was stunned before his mouth spread into a wild grin. Your timing couldn't be any better, Elther. Lionel's mind raced as it quickly memorized the information Elther was sending to him. A list of disaster planets, branches, and stores the Milky Way Guild owned were all systematically organized by Lionel. In the blink of an eye, Lionel had a grasp of much of the Milky Way Guild's situation. Lionel wasn't naive enough to believe that this represented all the assets the guild had, but it was more than enough. In fact, he was surprised that Elther had managed to gather so much. That woman he's working with isn't simple. She knows too much. Who is she exactly? Lionel frowned for a moment before throwing it to the back of his mind. It didn't matter who this woman was. She might have all this information, but he would be the one to act on it. As they say, crime pays. Chapter 947. Chapter 947. Elder Lamine. In a particular room within the guild house, several elders could be found shaking their heads. Among them, there were the elders who had just given Lionel his certification and Isoltine. But at the moment, Isoltine was like a mama bear who had just witnessed her cub's tail being stepped on. Is this really what we're doing? You can just blatantly target one of our own now. Isol, that's shield cross. I don't care who it was. Isoltine snapped. So anyone can just accuse our crafters as they please and then target them as long as their fist is large enough? Did you all forget that the guild has numerous branches just like Shield Cross Stars does? Why do we have to fear them? The lips of the elders twitched. Come on, Isol, you know we don't have the firepower to go against them. Plus, we have a symbiotic relationship. Oh, so you remember that too? How could they finish their fancy little uniforms without us? If we put our foot down and refused to craft any more for them, what do you think would happen? On top of that, when has a crafter ever feared someone with power? We could have destroyed that whole fleet with a press of a button, but you bumbling buffoons didn't even let me go help little Lionel. Visit. For a better user experience, did you not see? They brought 3 enforcers with them. 3. Had you gone out, how long do you think you would have lasted? If you're a coward, just say so. Isoltine sneered. The elders looked toward one another at a loss for words. She was acting like Lionel was her grandson when they had known each other for all of one day. They couldn't even reason with her. And to make matters worse, we agree with Isoltine. It's one thing if Lionel wasn't already one of us, but not only is he also has our branch's emblem. Because you all forced us to wait for the guild head's approval, for all we know, his heart might have grown cold toward us. This guild branch was just one of many not only in the dimensional verse, but of the Milky Way as well. There were dozens of branches across just this galaxy alone. They didn't particularly care about branches of other galaxies, but they were in constant competition with branches that called this place home alongside them. The addition of Lionel would have been a great help to them, even setting Isoltin's clear overprotection aside. When things were framed in that way, they were losing out not just face, but also tangible benefits, all because they took a step back to shield cross stars. The elders that hadn't participated in Lionel's certification suddenly had ugly expressions. They had all seen how Lionel took just a few minutes to complete 6 bronze-grade crafts. Granted, those materials had already been processed, but if they used that as an excuse they would really lose all face. What's all this commotion about? What the hell happened to my gardens? The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. An old man who seemed to have a foot in the grave, but the mouth of a belligerent teenager strolled in. Despite his frail frame, his presence seemed to command the room. If Lionel had been there, it would have only taken him a moment to realize that this old man was a quasi-sixth-dimensional existence. Guild head. The elders respectfully greeted before Isoltine, as spitefully as she could, recounted the events. As he listened, the expression of the guild head only became darker and darker. Shield Cross Stars has a lot of nerve. The near growl of the old man made those who realized the complexity of the situation nearly faint. They all knew that the old man treated Isoltine like his own daughter and had for years. He was too easily influenced by her emotions. If she felt wronged, then he would seek out vengeance for this wrong. The issue was that there were still dozens of other branches. They couldn't speak for all of them. In fact, there were most definitely many among those branches that would purposely stand in opposition to them just so they would lose out on a talent like Lionel. The more this blew up, the more disadvantageous it would become to them, especially if they took too hard of a stance. Doing such a thing would give their enemies license to counter. The latest _AP_SODIES are on the website. Don't worry, little Isol, our Golden Path branch isn't made up of pushovers. Ah! At that moment, an older man who sat in a corner to himself, not having participated until just now, suddenly cleared his throat. Seeing him finally about to do something, the others sighed in relief. Isoltine and Jakriak, the guild head, were like 2 highly combustible bundles of TNT. This older man, though without their status, had always been the voice of reason. Elder Lumine, please advise. An elder said quickly before anyone could interrupt. Lumine coughed lightly. We should toe the line. Going directly against Shield Cross Stars is inadvisable, but this doesn't mean that the only other option is to be in lockstep with them. Hold a ceremony to induct Lionel as one of our own. His name should appear amongst our crafters, and as a member of our Golden Path branch. However, we also don't need to explain our actions to Shield Cross Stars. We are simply following the rules of our guild. We allow people in based on skill, not their criminal record. This way, Lionel will know where we stand, and Shield Cross Stars also won't go too far. If they try to upgrade him to a Tier 3 fugitive now, this matter might blow up in their faces. Visit. For a better user experience at the same time, this will give Lionel free access to enter any of our guild branches without issue. If he's as smart as I believe he is, he will know what kind of opportunity that is, and he will take advantage. If he plays this well, then the other branches will have no choice but to stand on our side whether they want to or not. Once he finished saying these words, Elder Lumine returned to his nap, leaving the other elders gazing toward one another. Important note, author down. If my wrists had eyes, they'd be crying right now. I must have tweaked it sometime yesterday, and not writing feels like I'm being pricked 1,000 needles. There'll only be one more chapter today as a result. I'm hoping it'll be better tomorrow. It doesn't seem like too bad of an injury, that you're tuning into the Limay's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.